The advice and opinions expressed by the host of Autism Live and her guests are meant solely as suggestion and should not be in any way construed as child-specific advice. The Center for Autism and Related Disorders advises working with a board-certified behavior analyst who has experience with autism before starting any intensive behavioral intervention. Any choices you make in determining your child's treatment are completely at your own discretion.
Well, I had friends when I was in high school in preferred activities like horseback riding, electronics, or model rockets. There's a tendency sometimes to just go on and on and on talking about the same thing. And this is where someone had to tell me, you're going to tell that story twice, and that's all that people are going to want to hear it. They're going to get bored with it after hearing it more than twice. Give them, say, hey, you've talked too much about that robot. Let's talk about something else. Well, let's give some examples of things that are not perfect. Okay, if a photographer's working for the National Geographic, that would be at the pinnacle of photography career. But if you go through the National Geographic, you're probably going to find some technical errors like flare in some of the pictures. But overall, such a great picture, even though it had flare, you still use the picture. Also, if he's a science kid, bring up the concept of absolute zero, where all atomic motion is stopped. You can never get there, you can only approach it. Get the concept across of work up to a certain standard. It doesn't have to be perfect, it's got to be up to a certain standard. Well, when I was a young kid, there were expectations for doing things that other people want. It gets back to turn taking. I had to sit through church even though I thought it was boring. That's something the other members of the family wanted to do. And there were expectations for me not to be disruptive. And most of the time I behaved. And that's just one step beyond turn-taking in board games. You've got to learn to get your turn. Sometimes you get to pick out the movie, and other times brother or sister may pick out the movie we go to. Well, one of my really important teachers was Mr. Carluck, my science teacher. And he had interesting projects for me to do. And I worked on all kinds of stuff with optical illusions. And that actually helped me in some of my cattle work because it made me pay attention to what the animals were seeing. And then doing interesting science projects got me motivated to study because now I had a reason for studying. Studying was a way to get to a goal of becoming a scientist. This is where a good teacher really turns a student around. Well, there's a lot of problems in the sensory system. Distorted input, sort of like pictures pixelating with a bad satellite dish, audio cutting in and out like a really bad cell phone. A lot of the sensory systems are not working normally. In my book, The Autistic Brain, I've got a whole big section in there on sensory issues. And there's an interesting new study that's come out called Environmental Enrichment is an Effective Treatment for Autism. Now, I want to make it very clear. This does not replace ABA or speech therapy. It is an adjunct. And what's done in this, and there's a paper you can get online called Environmental Enrichment's Effective Treatment for Autism. You stimulate two senses at the same time, like maybe you do an aromatherapy, a cinnamon, something like that, touch carpet. You always changing the pair of senses that you stimulate. And one of the senses is always one of the more primitive senses, smell, touch, or balance. So there's a lot of emphasis on 8 different aromatherapies, and the people were, children were evaluated baseline. Controls got ABA and speech therapy. Experimentals got this additional sensory therapy. And then after quite a few months, they evaluated them again, and the experimental group that had the treatment had significantly better behavior. This is a refereed scientific journal article. and it uses simple household things, very simple to do. Environmental enrichment is an effective treatment for autism. You can download it online. I'll tell you some things not to do. Don't say he went to sleep, because then the child might be afraid that he went to sleep. When I was very young, we were out for a walk and came across a very flat squirrel in the middle of the road that had been run over. And it was very clear that the squirrel could not be put back together again. And that made me learn not to run out in the street, because I wouldn't want to be like that squirrel. And there's no way the veterinarian could do surgery and put him back together again. I mean, basically, you know, death of a person, they are gone. They are gone. Well, Oliver Sacks is a very kindly kind of professor type of person, and I read an article he wrote in the New York Times just before he died about, you know, going back doing the Jewish Sabbath. And at the end of the article, he was talking about, well, if A, then B, then C, which way of his life could have gone down different paths. And I started really weeping when I read that article, you know, and I'm glad it went down the path that, you know, where our paths crossed. I could barely print it out, I was so upset. No, fortunately, he was writing right up until the end. And he's overall really satisfied with his life. Well, after the article appeared in the New Yorker magazine, shortly after that, an agent appeared that suggested that I ought to write a book. And that's what brought the book Thinking in Pictures into being.
Hey, I'm Candace Cameron Bure.
Tom Bergeron.
You're watching Autism Live.
And you're watching Autism Live.
And you're watching Autism Live.
You're watching Autism Live.
So thank you for joining us. We're here with The Future is Bright, and we have a very special guest, Temple Grandin. Doctor, thank you for joining us. We're
It's
so
good
excited
to be here.
have you. Thank you. You just gave a great speech at the 46th annual conference here in Denver, Colorado, and we would love to take an opportunity to just ask you a couple of questions
Okay.
about a hot topic for you now that is employment.
Yep.
And helping people with autism become gainfully employed, and what we can do as they're growing up, you know, through the high school years and through those younger years, maybe before they're old enough to get a real job, as you'd call it. What's your advice for parents out there and what they can do with their kids today to help them?
The problem with autism is, since they changed the guidelines for diagnosis in 2013, the spectrum has become extremely broad. At one end of the spectrum, you're going to have Silicon Valley programmers, you know, really good artists, I mean, really talented people. And at the other end of the spectrum, you're going to have someone that's going to remain nonverbal with some very severe handicaps, and it's all got the same word. You see, if you diagnose a kid with dyslexia, you still have a fully verbal kid with normal intelligence, can't read. ADHD, you know, you've got the hyperactivity and attention problems. It's a much narrower spectrum if someone has ADHD or they're dyslexic. Autism now, you've got this huge quagmire of a spectrum. And the only time I can give a specific recommendation across the whole spectrum is if the kid's 2.5 or 3 with no speech, you must start early intervention, 20 hours a week of one-on-one teaching. There's various ABA and other methods that work, but you got to start, and you got to start now. I can give you a canned answer. Once a child gets older, they're kind of merging into 3 different groups.
What are the groups?
Well, you're going to have a kid that's going to remain nonverbal with very severe handicaps. And some of the ones that look very low functioning actually have a locked-in syndrome with normal intelligence inside.
Okay.
Then you have a moderate group where you've got some speech, but it isn't really normal speech. Reading might be, you know, 4th grade level, sort of like that. And then you've got the high-end group where they often are really smart in one thing, like math or art or maybe verbal, and then they have a deficit in another thing. And the education system puts too much emphasis on the deficits, not enough emphasis in building up the area of strength. If you've got a 3rd grader that's good in math, let's give them harder math and let's introduce them to programming.
Okay.
Because that's something that could turn into a job. You know, the programs that are hot right now are C++ and JavaScript, Ruby and Python. The courses are free online, but the kid's not going to get interested in that unless you introduce it.
And who should be doing that? How do you recognize that you've got a kid with, let's say, a great math capability or great
All
art
right, so the
capability?
kid, you should give the kid the 3rd grade math. He instantly learns it. Let's get the 4th grade book out. Let's get the 5th grade book out. Let's get the 6th grade book out. If he can do the college book in 3rd grade, fine, let him.
Okay.
He's probably going to need special ed.
So
reading.
very early.
Oh yeah, don't make him do baby math. He's going to get bored, and I guarantee you he'll be a gigantic behavior problem when he's bored.
It sounds like you think there might be a little bit of a coddling issue where parents are concerned.
Oh, I think there's a big coddling issue on just learning things like greeting. I'm really appalled at meetings where come to a meeting, here is a 12-year-old completely and fully verbal that does not know how to shake hands. He doesn't know how to greet. You see, the manners in the 50s were taught in a much more structured way.
Right.
And teachable moments were used. Like if I picked up my potatoes with my hand, and I'm not French fries, but mashed potatoes with my hand, Mother would say, use the fork. She didn't scream no. She'd say, use the fork. That's a teachable moment.
Healthy alternative.
And I was at a very fancy dinner one time at a college, and there was a 12-year-old kid there, fully verbal, and he started to eat the food with his hands. And I just said, this is a fancy dinner. You're not eating like that in front of me. You use the utensils. And he did.
So it's
I
just
just
calling him
gave the
out.
instruction. But you give the instruction. I didn't yell at him. You give the instruction. But there's a tendency to overprotect. I'm seeing too many fully verbal kids that don't know how to shop.
Sure.
They're not doing any chores in the home. Just basic things. Greeting people. When I was 8 years old, Mother had me party hostess at her parties. And I had to greet the guests and serve the snacks.
So it sounds like your mother had a lot of faith in your ability to just take those tasks that she was giving you and do them.
Well,
and
so
you're saying,
you got to stretch these kids.
Stretch
you see,
them,
the kids
okay.
getting labeled autistic, the babying them, and you know, if you have a little kid, you know, that's severe behaviors. I was severe behaviors when I was 3 years old.
Sure.
You know, of course, the parents are gonna be upset about that. But then you got another kind of kid, 10 years old, no friends, geeky and nerdy, gets a label, and not enough's being done to engage his area of strength and teach him basic skills. Because what makes me crazy is I go back and forth between different silos. I'll do a talk out at Silicon Valley. You can go to the big tech companies. It's Asperger's everywhere. Cube after cube full of them. Headphones clamped on, don't even look up at you. I can go to the meatpacking plants. There's a whole shop full of hippies there. And I know they're on the spectrum. They've been there for years. This is what makes me crazy when I go out into the cattle world or the tech world or even the academic world, and I find older people my age, maybe 10 years old, that are on the spectrum, but they're not diagnosed.
So it sounds like you're saying in today's society, less helicopter parenting.
That's right.
And more, you know, you must do this, and reinforcing, these are the manners you need, this is how
Well,
we
you
act.
just treat them, you got to move them just outside the comfort zone. I just met a lady when I was down in Argentina. I said, well, I can only shop at this one supermarket, this one newsstand. I can't go to another store. You know what I did with her? We watched out of that meeting, and we went to a new newsstand.
So
and
you
I brought her up
through.
to it, and I said, buy that magazine there. She wrung her hands a little bit, and she bought it.
Okay,
You
so
know,
you made someone else walk through the proverbial
I did.
door. Good for
That's
you.
right. That's what I did. I did that last week.
And you're encouraging parents to do the same thing with their kids
And then
now.
we're going to be getting into looking at the job front.
Okay, now that's something you just gave a great speech about, and it sounds like that's this new hot topic for you about how kids in their maybe early teens, maybe before they're really able to get formal jobs, should be out doing maybe the paper route type equivalent.
Okay, we don't have paper routes anymore. In fact, I got asked
The equivalent.
I got asked the other day what a paper route is.
You're kidding.
No, I'm not kidding. And
By an
I
adult?
said, well, you know, they used to have children deliver newspapers to people's
Sure.
houses, and that taught really valuable skills.
Okay.
Okay, now we don't have that today.
But
How
what's the
about
equivalent?
walking some dogs for the neighbors? You can do that in the city.
Okay.
You know, but not your own dogs, somebody else's dogs, and you got to go over that at 2 different apartments at 6 o'clock in the morning, take those dogs out and walk them every day, even when the weather's nasty. Or maybe working in the farmer's market. Okay, we were just discussing New York City, where my mother lives. When I stay at the hotel in New York and I walk 6 blocks to my mother's apartment, I go by 5 or 6 street vendors. Okay, a kid that's like 12 or 13 years old, have them help out a street vendor. They've got to start learning work skills. If they're out in the suburbs, they could help out in the farmer's market.
Okay.
Let's start getting creative. Let's start off with church and synagogue jobs, things like that. Church ushers, setting up chairs for the church social. Yes, it's a job. Every Thursday night, you got to do those chairs.
So it's the accountability, being somewhere where someone's expecting you to help out and do a particular
Then
thing.
it's a defined task. You got
Okay.
100 chairs to put up.
Defined.
and you got 100 chairs you're going to have to put away after the event is over.
So defined and repetitive, and something that they do.
Well, a lot
not
of jobs
for
are
the
repetitive.
family.
Newspaper routes are repetitive. But let's go through my work history. These kids have got to learn work skills outside the home before they graduate from high school. All right. When I was 13, mother just in the neighborhood found a little seamstress that did dressmaking out of her home. And she went in and told about me. I was kind of different,
Sure.
but I was really good at hand sewing. So the lady started having me hand sew the hems and take apart dresses. When I was 15, I was cleaning horse stalls.
Okay.
Then when I got a little bit older, I was making signs and selling them. And the first sign I ever made was for a beauty shop. First sign I ever made for a customer. I had made some other signs before that. But making things, and you have to learn how to make signs that other people want. And then even when I was getting my master's, I was making signs.
So
The carnival. And then
our
my
kids.
aunt's ranch. At my aunt's ranch, there was some work stuff. I had to take guests out on trail rides, and I had to do some, she had guests there. I had to wait
So
on
you were
tables there, too.
accountable. You were given
Yeah.
various tasks and you were accountable. It sounds like that you're endorsing that we have our kids go out there when they're younger and do these, smaller jobs for people in the neighborhood or small business owners and learn those skills before they get to
Okay,
a
now some
job-related
states you
age.
can work in safe retail at 14.
Okay.
A lot of other states at 16. Well, let's say you got a friend 2 blocks away, like a little tax accounting office.
Sure.
They can put the kid to work in there.
Perfect.
Cash economy.
Something.
They've got to learn work skills. And just look at the things they're maybe it's a little coffee
Something.
stand that's in the neighborhood, and the kid when he's 12 can go help out with that. And he's expected there at certain hours every week. It's a job.
Okay. And so that's the importance of it all, is just
They
to
have
get
got
them out
to
there.
learn how to work. And when I was 14, I got kicked out of school for fighting and throwing a book. Went to a very expensive boarding school. Spent 3 years of that time running up a horse barn and cleaning horse stalls. And what Mr. Patey, the headmaster, realized, I was learning job skills. That was super important. And then when I finally got interested in science and studying, I kind of did a year of high school in a year.
Okay.
But I had been working in the horse barn. I had learned that the responsibility. Every afternoon, you got to clean every stall, put them in and out, feed them.
So it's responsibility. Have our
That's
parents
right.
allow their kids to get out there and just not be afraid to do it before
They
they
got to get out.
Okay.
And the Project Search research has shown very clearly that working in a real job a whole year before they graduate from high school is very, very important for keeping employment after they graduate.
Okay, so along those same lines, now you've got a group of kids in today's society who have gotten out there and, let's say, worked at these little carts or local small businesses informally while they're younger, and they get older and they're able to get into the workforce. They need to get there. You got to get to your job. So you have to be able to drive if you can, if you're capable of driving. Talk to us about your stance on driving.
Well, driving was essential for me. I would have never been able to go into the cattle industry without driving. There's a scene in the movie where I get kicked out of Scottsdale Feed Yard. I was driving.
It was
If
beautiful.
I hadn't have been driving, I wouldn't have gone to Scottsdale Feed Yard to get kicked out of it.
Yep.
And so how did I learn to drive?
How?
On my aunt's ranch. We were 3 miles to go up to the mailbox and 3 miles back. And she started having me drive up to the mailbox on a dirt road. Well, over the whole summer, that was 6 miles a day, 6 days a week, I put 200 miles on that truck driving just on this dirt road.
Just to pick up the mail.
Just to pick up the mail. That's what we had to do. That's the way it was on the ranch. The mailbox was 3 miles away.
Okay.
So that was 200 miles of driving. That's a tank of gas. And I hadn't been near any serious traffic at that point.
Okay.
I think what you need to be doing is burning up a tank of gas in a totally safe place. Country dirt roads, giant, big, deserted parking lots, or open, dry, flat fields. Because there are some multitasking issues, and what the kid needs to do is he's got to learn how to operate that car before we go near any traffic. And the problem with driver's ed is they put them into traffic too fast. So I want to burn up this tank of gas in a totally safe place, then you do the driver's ed.
Okay.
So they fully learn how to steer, brake, stop. You can practice parking, practice all kinds of stuff, because this deals with the problems with executive function and multitasking. See, when you learn a motor skill like driving, you first of all have to think about how to steer, how to brake, and how to use the gas. Now, as you practice it, you no longer have to think about it. It just goes in your motor cortex.
Sure.
Well, before we go near any traffic, I want operation of the car migrated into the
secondary.
motor cortex of the brain.
So once that's second nature, and a kid goes out there and is learning how to drive on, let's say, this deserted road
Yeah,
or this
that's
open
right.
parking lot, and they've got steering down, and you want to maybe throw some things into the mix before they ever go into driver's ed, like it's raining, there's windshield wipers, and you need to look at your turn signal, and oh, by the way, you're about to park, those types of
Well,
things.
then you start teaching them how to use the turn signals.
Teach them everything.
You just teach them everything, and then even after I got a car, I went to Franklin Pierce College, but that was out in the country. There was some traffic, but it was really mild traffic. So I was another year on easy roads before I did any really serious traffic. Also, like downtown Denver, I just absolutely hate coming here. I actually avoid the rush hour, but you see the airport route, I know exactly where the lanes are, where I have to get over.
It's a more comfortable route.
The airport's totally comfortable.
Okay.
You know, so like going to the airport's easy. And see, all my agricultural jobs were out in the country. So,
Sure.
But even on Denver traffic, okay, I would learn a certain route. There's some really bad exits where you can get forced off. Well, then I got to learn where I got to get over when I'd learn the route. But it's just going to take longer. So I'm recommending a tank of gas in a totally safe place before we do any driver's ed, a year on easy roads before we do downtown traffic or crowded freeways.
Just a period of acclimation, it sounds
That's right.
like. Okay.
It's going to take longer.
For multitasking skills in general, whether it's
Well,
driving
multitasking is the problem. You see, and the way to avoid the multitasking is there's no multitasking if the operation of the car is migrated out of frontal cortex back to the motor cortex. So you don't have to think about driving the car.
So you want that extra time.
That's right. And then turn signals, well, you can practice that even on my aunt's ranch, where we would go up to the mailbox. There was one turn to the mailbox where I could practice a turn signal.
Okay. Okay, so that's driving.
That's right.
Now they can get to the job. They've learned how to drive. They've had their practice at manners at a young age and doing some of these informal jobs. Do you have specific advice for what we can tell adults with autism who feel like they've got the right skills to get out into the workforce?
Let's short circuit the interview process.
Okay.
Because when we were just talking about this at the tech conference I was just at across the street with Specialist Cistern, that company, tech company that hires people on the autism spectrum, and they were talking about how they got to short circuit the interview process, and the way that I would do interviews is to simply show off my portfolio. I'd show pictures of things I designed, drawings. Okay, if it's a programmer, it needs to show a computer in there. Here's some C++ that code and it does this, and I got some JavaScript and it does this, and you just show off your portfolio.
So maybe a different kind of interview
That's
process
right.
for people
That's
on
right.
the spectrum.
And then once they get on the job, the thing employers have to realize is you cannot be vague. There's a scene in the movie where my boss slammed down the deodorant and said, "You stink, use it." That happened.
Right.
They got to clean up themselves, and I did it. And that boss, I'm pretty sure, was on the spectrum.
But you
that
said
did
you
that.
appreciated that.
Now,
because
I was
it
very
direct.
angry at the time. I was very angry and upset at the time, but I wanted the job. I thank that boss now, and I thank Linda Carpenter and her other secretary friend that took me out to buy the clothes.
Okay. So are there things that you would recommend to employers that they can do to be more receptive to people with autism?
A lot of people on the spectrum are going to need a quiet place to work.
Okay.
You know, some of these restrooms have these horrible Dyson blade air hand dryers. Now, if my office cube was next to that, I wouldn't be able to work.
I wouldn't either.
I've got to get away from that. And quiet place to work. Also, clearly define the tasks. Even now, I mean, when I do consulting, I've worked on a big manuscript with 15 other people. And I just said, I need homework. Okay, tell me I'll write this part of the manuscript, and I'll do it in this format, get it done on this date.
Okay.
Then, when I read through all the rest of the manuscript, I found some technical errors. You know, some things there might be opinion. These were purely technical errors. Another person corrected them, no track changes, just sent it on in.
Okay.
Because you don't rub the other person's nose in their mistakes.
Well,
Because I got in trouble for doing some of that.
That's good practice anyway.
Yeah.
That's just nice, social skills. So it sounds like then, to just recap it, for employers today to clearly define tasks for people on the
That's
spectrum who are coming into the workplace, that's a great way to be sensitive
All right,
to
let's say
helping them
it's
succeed.
programming. You don't just say develop new software. That's too vague.
Right.
They've got to write
Be
some
direct.
code that does. You don't tell them how to write the code. That's up to the ASPE to do that. But what is the outcome? Okay, that's to go on a certain platform, be a certain language,
Sure.
and it's got to achieve a certain outcome.
Great.
And there's some deadlines.
Great. And deadlines, okay.
Well, when I worked for the magazine, the deadline was so many column inches by the 15th of each month. and I was to cover a wide variety of livestock topics.
Well, I think that that's great advice for employers out there, because it's been a big question, and I know we're out of time, we have to wrap up, but it's been great to talk to you about just the employment issue in general. My advice to employers as an attorney would be, give them a quiet place, give them the well-defined tasks.
There's one other issue I want to talk about, and that's the video game addictions. I'm seeing way too many kids where moms are coming to me and says, he's 21, I can't get him out of the basement, and he's 18, I can't get him out of the bedroom. We've got to limit the video game playing.
Well, I think all parents sort of feel that way. And
well, we've got to, because they're not having good outcomes.
The more you limit the video games, and the more you can do, like what you said, is to help socialize people. The more we spend one-on-one time, like you and I have, talking to each other face to face, the more we all benefit by better social skills.
I'm not suggesting banning video games, but the rule for me was 1 hour of TV during the week and 2 hours on Saturday, 2 hours on Sunday, so they can do it.
And that's
That's
a great way to wrap it up. That's great advice.
You can't let them play video games for 8 hours a day.
Well, of course not. Of course not. I think all parents would agree with you, but especially.
But unfortunately, I'm seeing too many kids where that's happening.
Okay. Well, it's good advice. It's good advice if you want to be successful in the employment industry.
The other thing is, you've got to expose kids to enough different things. Like, how's a kid going to find out he might like acting for a career if there's no school play? How's he going to find out he likes fixing cars if there's no auto shop? They've taken these things out of the schools. I think it's completely wrong. Kids are not getting exposed to enough different things to become careers.
Okay. So lots of exposure. Gosh, thank you so much, Temple. We appreciate your time. It's been fabulous. Thank you for joining us on The Future's Bright.
We have so many parents who've asked questions, and they love your answers. I want to start with a question that we got on Facebook, that somebody wants to know your views on inclusion.
Well, I think a lot depends upon the particular situation. And for young children, elementary school children, I want to try to do inclusion as much as what's practically possible, because little kids need to get the socialization. Now, I was one of these teenagers that in a big high school, I was teased to death. It was just absolutely terrible. It just absolutely did not work. And I was one of the teenagers that had to be taken out of a big high school. And where inclusion totally worked for me in elementary school. I was in a little country school, very small classes. It was a private school, but it was very much like a small rural elementary school that I've seen in rural communities. Older, experienced teachers, and that worked really well. But I was one of the ones that had to be taken out, and I went to special boarding school, and I've had some parents take their kid out and homeschool them. And all I want to say, if they homeschool their kid in high school, they cannot let them become a recluse in their room. When I went away to the special boarding school, I had a tendency to want to do that, and they wouldn't allow that. They let me do lots of different things that I wanted to do, and when I wanted to clean the horse barn, they got me insulated boots so my feet wouldn't freeze off, but I had to be at meals on time. Even though I didn't do much studying, I had to attend classes. One thing they absolutely would not allow was for me to become a recluse in my room. And I had to be out doing things. But there's some kids where getting away from the whole teenage scene is the best thing you can do, and socialize with grown-ups.
Yeah.
Because I'll be perfectly honest, socializing with teenagers is not a life skill that I need.
Well, I think a lot of people would agree with you there, Temple.
But on the other hand, I've seen situations where they decide to homeschool their teenager, and he became a video game recluse, and ended up on Social Security going nowhere.
Yeah.
And that makes me nuts.
Yeah.
Because when I go out into the technical world, there's old Aspies and there's old geeks and nerds out there that would be definitely diagnosed on the spectrum today. Old gray hairs my age, and they've got jobs.
Yeah.
Jobs they like, and they've kept those jobs.
Well, we've got another parent who wants to know what you think about the recent statistics that somebody was quoted as saying that in 2012 that the numbers for autism at the rate that we're growing could be as high as 1 in 9. and what your thoughts are on those numbers.
Well, some of it's just increased diagnosis. I mean, the geeks and the nerds and the Asperger's, they've always been around. Now, they're going to be changing the diagnostic criteria in May to take the mild, kind of socially awkward person and call them social communication disorder rather than autism, which is really rubbish because the social communication problems are the core deficit in autism as far as I'm concerned. So some of this is just increased diagnosis. And I think there is some severe autism and severe problems that have increased. And there's also a good number of mental retardation that has now being called autism. And mental retardation diagnoses have actually gone down. You see, people seek the autism diagnosis to get services. And I think one of the reasons why in the DMS-5 they're changing that, they're taking out Asperger's, is they're trying to cut down on the amount of people labeled autism. I think the committee actually did that on purpose for that reason. And the problem is diagnosis is not precise. And in my new book, The Autistic Brain, Richard Panik and I are going to be going through the whole entire history of the diagnosis. It makes you kind of sick because it kept changing. It's doctors sitting around a conference room table, making decisions on this.
Absolutely. Have you had a chance to look at the DSM-5, Temple? Do you...
I looked at it when they had it posted on the webpage.
Right.
I was able to look at it. It's now off the webpage. But I did have a chance to look at it. And basically, Asperger's is going to be removed. And most of the kids that are the Asperger's are going to be called social communication disorder. And they say that that's not autism, which is rubbish. And they're also getting very murky about the speech delay. All of it like more muddled and murky.
And I'm just curious, because we all had that opportunity to look at it and to make suggestions. Do you feel like you would still be considered on the spectrum by the DSM? You would still qualify?
I would. I would definitely still qualify because I had severe speech delay. And when I was a young child, I had all the full-blown symptoms of classic autism: rocking, spinning, tantrums, no eye contact, fixated interest, repetitive behavior. Because basically on the DSM-5, there's two things you got to have. You got to have the social communication problems, and then the other thing is the repetitive behaviors and fixated interests. And I definitely had that. I would definitely still be diagnosed.
Okay. And which kind of leads into the next question. One of our viewers wants to know what problems that you still face being autistic.
Well, I don't multitask well. That's still a problem I face. And fortunately, I have a job that doesn't require multitasking or remembering long strings of verbal information. It's antidepressants have controlled anxiety for me. I'm a visual thinker, and us visual thinkers tend to get a lot of anxiety problems. And a low dose of an antidepressant, some people a little Prozac, Zoloft, or Lexapro. I'm on an old-fashioned tricyclic. Just a little tiny dab stops that constant panic attacks and anxiety. And you have to use very low doses, because if you use too high a dose, you get agitation and insomnia. And if you're interested in that, I'd recommend that you read A Believer in Biochemistry. That's a chapter in my book, Thinking in Pictures, or read the second edition of The Way I See It book.
Spectacular, wonderful. And in particular, this same viewer was asking what really has helped you to become the person that you are today. Was it therapy? Was it social therapy? And what do you feel is the main reason that you've had so much progress in your life?
Well, first of all, I had superb, excellent early intervention. And the kind of early intervention that was done with me when I was totally nonverbal. I did not talk completely fluently until age 4. I had a lot of ABA-type therapy. It wasn't called ABA back in those days, but a lot of things like my speech therapist would hold up a cup and say cup. When I was 3, my mother hired a nanny who played constant turn-taking games with me and my sister, constantly keeping me engaged. And my ability in art was always encouraged. My abilities were encouraged. And I used to just draw endless horse heads, and I was encouraged to draw lots of other things. And limits were set on me. Like if I had a tantrum at school, the rule was no television that night. That was the rule, and it was enforced. Great teachers in elementary school, a very, very good, just old-fashioned teachers in an old-fashioned 50s-style classroom. Then when I went to high school, it was my science teacher, Mr. Patey, the head of the boarding school, Mr. Patey had a really good sense of when to let me off the hook and not study, but he was not going to let me become a recluse in my room. Mr. Carlock, my science teacher, it was a whole lot of things. And then there were some good people in the cattle industry. I mean, the movie makes it look like everybody in the cattle industry was just awful. There were excellent, good people. Jim the contractor, Ted Gilbert at the Red River Feed Yard. There were some excellent ranches that did treat cattle right. And there were some good people, and that kept me going. But people are always looking for the single magic turning point. There's not one. The other thing that really helped me, learning work skills. When I was 13, Mother had me doing a little sewing job 2 afternoons a week in a lady's house, and I took apart dresses and hemmed them. When I was 15, I was cleaning 8 horse stalls. I was doing carpentry work. When I was in college, I did an internship at a research lab where I actually had to rent my own house. You see, you've got to stretch these kids.
Yeah.
I'm seeing too many people on the mild end of the spectrum today, people a lot milder than me, they're playing video games on Social Security because they were never stretched. My take on video games is 1 hour a day.
Okay.
I was allowed to play a 50s video game when I was a little kid for 1 hour a day. And that 50s video game was spinning a brass thing round and round and round that covered up a bolt on my bed. And I was allowed to do that for an hour after lunch, to just veg out and do that. Well, that's the same thing that ought to be done with video games. 1 hour a day.
I love that prescription. I'm going to play this for my son, Temple.
And I would never recommend banning them. Actually, there's some visual spatial skills you can learn from video games. I just was reading an article in one of my Science or Nature magazines. But that article, where there was a benefit in playing video games, it was only 1 hour a day they did.
Okay.
It wasn't 8 hours a day.
Yeah. Well, I love that, because a lot of us parents are asking questions and saying, what's an appropriate amount? And an hour seems like a great, it gives them time to play,
That's right.
but puts a limit on it. So I love that.
That's exactly what Mother did with me with spinning things. I was allowed to have an hour after lunch where I could go in my room and I could spin things, twirl the brass plate on my bed round and round and round, watch it twirl. And then after I came out of my room, I was not allowed to do that.
I got to ask you, Temple, what was it about the spinning that was exciting enough for you to do it for an entire hour? Do you remember what it was about?
Oh, yes, I remember. I could twirl it. It was sort of a hanging brass plate that was on a screw that covered up a bolt that held the bed frame together. And I'd spin it at different speeds. And I'd watch how it went back and forth when it stopped spinning all the way around. And I would experiment all different kinds of speeds of it. And I just sort of studied it like a scientist.
Wow.
And I found it fascinating. Another thing I did is I dribbled sand through my hand. We go to the beach. And I dribbled sand through my hand, and I'd study every little rock of the sand that went through my hand. And I would just stand there all day, and I would dribble the sand at different speeds. You know, hold my fist tighter or hold my fist looser, and just study it.
It's just fascinating, and it kept your attention.
Oh, yes. And I was given some limited times to do these things. But it was on a schedule.
Yeah.
After lunch, I had an hour where I was in my room and I could do this stuff. And then at the table, it was absolutely not allowed. Church, it was not allowed. In the classroom, it was not allowed.
And when how did they work through? What was it like for you transitioning? Was it just that you understood that it was an hour and then it was over?
Well, I understood that, and it was you see. But this kind of having a schedule started very young.
Okay.
I mean, when the nanny we had 3 meals every day, and they were on time. Breakfast at 7, lunch at noon, dinner at 6.
So
and
structure was really important.
I had structure, but sometimes, things changed, and I didn't usually I got nervous about changes. When I was in high school and I was going full-blown on anxiety attacks, they wanted to change the schedule around in high school. I got all nervous about that. Now I've had to move out of my office. We have a mess now where they're rebuilding our building, remodeling our building, and we had to move all our offices, my 22 years of junk in my faculty office, and we moved into trailers.
Wow.
For a year. Well, I did that, but you know what? I did it slowly.
Okay.
Like 3 months before it was time to move, I was detrashing my office. And fortunately, they provided gigantic industrial-sized garbage cans for all the faculty to detrash their office, because the entire faculty had to move out of this building.
Yeah.
But I did it slowly.
You know what strikes me, Temple, is that that transition would be hard for anyone, but you are so good at recognizing what you need to be kind to yourself and to be successful, and then you do that. And I don't know that
That's
the
what I
rest
did.
of us do that.
Well, and I did it, and fortunately they had these big garbage cans because I hate to say it now, my knees are getting bad, and I can't walk upstairs lifting anything because my knees are going screaming, ouch, don't, you're hurting your knees. And you know, I would have had to, I simply can't carry all that stuff.
Yeah, but you know where your strengths are, and you know how to compensate when you have an area that isn't a strength, and that's something that we can all learn from.
Well, and you have to, I've learned things in organization. Like for my calendar, I've got to have a calendar where I can see an entire month.
Yeah.
I hate those calendar books where it's a new page for each day. Hate them. Hate them. Oh, I get those from American Express, and I just give them away. I hate them.
And by the week doesn't help you either. You need to see the whole month.
I want to see a whole month.
Wonderful.
I can look at it, and then when I make my plane reservations, I can look at that calendar, and then I visualize how much time I'm going to need between events. And I know that, and let me tell you, I know all the airline routing now.
I'll bet you do.
Now, I have that about memorized.
I'll bet you do. I've got a question here that you might decide is too personal, and you don't need to answer it if you don't want to, but somebody wants to know what role faith and spirituality plays in your life.
Well, when I was young, I did a lot of thinking about a lot of the big questions. But basically now, I figure the meaning of life is if the things that you do help make the world a better place. And what I mean by that is I have to use specific examples because I think very concretely. When a mother says, your book helped my kid go to college, that makes me happy.
Yeah.
Or you solved my kid's sensory problems. And boy, I can tell you, we've got to look at sensory problems.
Yeah.
And there's some individuals that can't tolerate a noisy Walmart. I'll give you some tips on sensory problems to help desensitize. Let the individual initiate the dreaded buzzer on the scoreboard or the worst ringtone on a phone or whatever the thing is they can't stand. If the person on the spectrum initiates it, or if they hate Walmart, let them control how much Walmart they got to tolerate. And when they give a signal, you take them out.
I
because
love
you
that.
kind of have to stretch it.
Yeah.
And then there's some individuals that will never tolerate that Walmart, especially some of you nonverbal individuals.
Yeah. Well, you know, that's great advice, Temple, because we've had a couple of parents, one parent in particular who's written in and talked about how her son, his lunch and his physical education take place in an old-fashioned gymnasium that has all wood floor, and it's very echoey in the room, and that it's hard for him. He's supposed to be socializing during lunch, but there's all this echoing noise.
Well, the problem is he cannot hear.
Oops.
I cannot hear in that environment either.
Yeah.
When I'm in a meatpacking plant, I cannot hear. I have got some auditory processing problems. I don't hear hard consonants. So when I'm in a meatpacking plant and we have to talk, I said, we got to go outside. I can't. I just tell him I can't hear.
Yeah.
And one of the problems he's got in that echoey gym is he simply cannot hear what other people are saying because there's auditory problems. The other thing, if you wear earphones or earplugs in the noisy gym, you've got to have those earplugs off for at least half the time because otherwise your brain will get more and more and more sensitive. You know, so half the day when it's quiet, get that headphone off and get those earplugs out.
And well, one of the things that we had recommended too is going in and recording what it's like in the gymnasium and maybe slowly desensitizing. But
that can help.
And what I'm hearing from you is to let the child turn the sound on and turn it off to desensitize.
Put it on a recorder. Put it on the recorder, but let the child turn it on and off. And that will help desensitize it so it'll tolerate the gym.
Yeah.
But what it will not do, it's not going to solve the problem with hearing conversations in the gym.
Yeah.
It will just make it so he can tolerate the gym. The other thing is, the other big problem in so many schools is fluorescent lights.
Yeah.
That's a serious problem for maybe 10% of the people on the spectrum. See, the problem we've got in the sensory stuff, it's so variable. Yeah. One kid's got visual problems. Another kid's got touch problems. Another kid's got auditory problems. And fluorescent lights, 60-cycle fluorescent lights are just the worst. And if you're in a classroom with that, then get the kid's desk over by the window. Or if you're stuck in a room with no windows and fluorescent lights, get some incandescent light bulbs in old lamps. Just get some old floor lamps, bring them in from home, put them next to the kid's desk. The other thing that can help is try printing books and things on different pastel papers. Experiment with the colored backgrounds on computers. And also experiment with colored glasses, like the Erlen colored glasses. But that's way too expensive for a lot of people. So just experiment with Walmart's blue tinted ones, some pink glasses, some pale tans, real pale different sunglasses. Just experiment with that.
Interesting. I know a lot of schools have for children who are dyslexic, they have, it almost looks like a paint chip fan that has different colored plastics that you can put over text for a child to be able to read with dyslexia.
And that helps too. And some of the autistic kids need to try that.
Okay, great.
And then if these kids that need that colored paper, if the classroom has windows, and there's fluorescent lights in the room, put that kid's desk over by the windows, and that will help a lot. That's a real simple thing you can do.
Great advice. We had a bunch of questions come in about potty training, about children who get obsessed with different parts of potty training. And for instance, one child that the mom reports that she wants to play in the toilet water and wants to flush it constantly, but does not want to pee in it. And another parent wants to know, is it common for kids with autism not to want to use the bathroom, and why?
All right, let's start out with sound sensitivity. See, when it comes to running water and flushing the toilet, some kids love it, and there's other kids that are terrified of the noise. And oftentimes you'll have a child that will use the toilet at home, but he won't use this one at school. And the problem you've got at school is they have those industrial ones that are really, really super loud.
Yeah.
And I can tell you the worst toilets, vacuum toilets on planes. Oh, if I had been exposed to that as a child, I would have been terrified. I would have been sure I would have been sucked out of the airplane.
Absolutely.
And I use them, and I use them all the time. And I press the button and I grit my teeth. I tolerate them.
Yeah.
But I can just, they try to find flights for some of these kids that don't have a vacuum toilet. They have the old-fashioned blue juice one, because those vacuum toilets, they are scary.
Oh, they are.
So you see, that is a noise sensitivity problem. Okay, now the other problem you have, especially with a nonverbal child, is he doesn't know what you're supposed to do in the toilet. You see, their sensory system is so fragmented. And if you want to understand this, you need to get Tito Muckapedahe's book, How Can I Talk If My Lips Don't Move? And Tito's a nonverbal person with autism that types independently, and he describes a scrambled sensory world. It's sort of like looking at everything with Picasso vision. And he describes that when he had to learn how to put on a T-shirt, it had to be put on him very, very slowly so he could get what the whole task was of going through the head hole, going through the armholes. And one of the things you got to do with someone like that is demonstrate how to use the toilet slowly, and he's got to see the entire thing. Like, how does the stuff get in the toilet? He's got to see it.
Okay.
You can't leave anything to the imagination. Because he's got to watch the whole task.
Okay.
Otherwise, they won't understand what they are supposed to do.
Well, it's great advice.
You can't break it up into steps. It's what I call whole task training.
Yeah, it's great advice, because I think we all are so concerned about privacy, but making sure that somebody models the whole task. It maybe isn't the prettiest thing.
And they got to see how the waste comes out of the person and drops in the toilet.
Okay,
because
great.
that step is often left out. I have talked to parents where their child would do it in front of the toilet, then pick it up and put it in the toilet.
Right.
They did that because they didn't understand the task. And when you read Tito's book, How Can I Talk When the Lips Don't Move, how he describes learning how to put a T-shirt on. And he describes a fragmented visual world. I think you'll understand better on working with some of these kids.
Interesting. Okay, we will definitely look into that book. We have a bunch of people who wrote in and specifically just wanted to thank you, Temple. I can't leave that out, because so many people wrote in and said that your lectures and your books have helped them. I certainly am one of those parents. But a couple of parents wrote in and wanted to know what your feelings were about the Sandy Hook Massacre now that there's been a little bit of time, and how you feel about the way society looks at individuals with autism.
Well, that guy had a lot of the classic symptoms, and he's an example of a kid that was allowed to become a recluse in his room playing violent video games. And then he was playing violent video games, shooting the same gun that he used for the actual crime. What should have been done with that kid, he should have had a job at a computer store. Get your butt out of the house, and you're going to work in a computer store. And that should have been done with him when you're going to take him out and homeschool him? He should have been working in a computer store. These kids have got to learn how to work.
Yeah.
And that is something that started with me at 13. And when you look at my Different Not Less book, Different Not Less is 14 old gray hairs like me that were diagnosed later in life, and that gave them a huge, wonderful insight into their marriages and their relationships. But one of them, who was a computer specialist, her boss asked her, well, if you'd been diagnosed earlier, would you have become an expert computer person at Intel? And this is the thing that worries me. These kids are not learning any work skills. And just about everybody in Different Not Less had paper routes.
Yeah.
And I know that those are gone. You know what the new paper route is? Dog walking.
There you go.
That's a great job for 12-year-olds. How about swimming pool cleaning, especially if you live down south? Because I want something that's not seasonal.
Yeah.
You know, mowing lawns is good, but it's seasonal.
Yeah.
But these kids have got to learn how to work.
Absolutely.
Museums will take kids as young as 12 years old for tour guides.
Okay.
You have to be 16 to volunteer in an animal shelter. They have got to learn work skills, and yes, volunteer work does count.
Well, and our entire topic this week, we're talking about on the show transitioning from teenage years to adulthood, and some of the things that we're talking about are job related, because I think on everybody's wish list for every child is that they be a productive member of society.
Well, the thing that drives me absolutely nuts is when I go out to a meatpacking plant, there's gray hairs like me all over that meatpacking plant that run the maintenance department. They do all kinds of jobs there, not just working on the line. That's like grunt work. And they're as spectrum as they could be, but they're undiagnosed.
Yeah.
And half of Silicon Valley is on the spectrum. You know, it's where people have got to learn work skills. And then you have the kids, you know, there's different kinds of minds. There's the visual thinkers like me, going to be really good at building things. There's a lot of these kids that ought to be going to the skilled trades. We have a huge, huge shortage of auto mechanics. And one of the worst things the schools ever did was taking out auto shop and metal shop and wood shop and art and all of those, cooking, all of those hands-on classes that can turn into great careers.
Yeah.
You know, and then sometimes we can do too many accommodations. Like here's one that's too much of an accommodation. There's a little elementary school kid that's too shy to get up and do his public speaking in class, so they let him do it on Skype. I'm going, no way. You're going to have to get up in front of the class.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you right now, when I gave my very first talk in graduate school, you know what I did? I panicked and I walked out. My very first talk. But then what I learned after that, got to have really good slides. And then if you freeze, you've got your slides.
Oh, that's great, because we actually had a question from somebody wanting to know, what are your tricks to get over fear of public speech? So having slides that you can go to and take a moment.
Well, let me just explain what we do with my students, because my graduate students have to, you know, do their little 10-minute presentations at the American Society for Animal Science, where they tell about their research. And the thing I work with my students on is having really good PowerPoint slides. You know, where you start out with the reason for doing the research, the methods, you know, the animals, the statistics, the procedure, the results, the discussion, the conclusions, and nice pictures on your slides, and then enough writing on your slides so if you panic, you read them.
There you go.
It's not the end of the world for your first talk.
Yeah. And you've talked in so many different venues now, and we've shown your TED Talk more than once here on the show because it's brilliant. And I just wonder, were you extra nervous for that, or was it just fine? Did you feel at home? I would think that would be panicking.
I was okay because I've done talks in enough big places. And I was okay with that. The only thing at the TED Talk I had problems with is they wanted me to wear this mic that was taped to my face. And I said to them, I've got to wear that for half an hour beforehand to get used to it. And I did that, and they had a lot of lights, which I don't really like, but I tolerated it because I wanted it to look good, and they wanted it to sound good.
Yeah.
And that's why they taped the mic to my cheek.
Well, it did look good, and it sounded great, and you were brilliant, and we love that TED Talk. I have another viewer who, her question is, how can I learn to control involuntary movements? I have trouble with it, and it's very distracting.
And what you have to try to do is to turn it into an involuntary movement that doesn't bother people. I know a guy that has Tourette's, and you'd never know it because he twitches his mouth and his eye. And it's something that, he does it every 30 seconds, but nobody notices. I never noticed it until he told me about it. You can try to switch the involuntary movement into something that's less distracting. There's a lot of people that sit in meetings and they jiggle their leg in meetings. Have you ever done that?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And there are people who click their pens.
Well, that gets annoying.
It does.
And I do an awful lot of doodling.
That's great.
Where I just take a pen and I'm drawing circles and I'm drawing little triangles and stars and stuff on a piece of paper. You could do that. You could get a fidget ball. I think what you need to try to do is to try to turn that into something. Because what can be done with Tourette's is you can't get rid of the tics. What you do is you change them into something else that's a lot less annoying and distracting. And what this guy did is he took a bad verbal tic and he turned it into twitching his mouth and his eye every 30 seconds, and nobody notices it.
There you go. Wonderful. Okay. Another viewer wants to know, what's your experience with fragmented vision, seeing only the details of things and not the whole picture? They report that, she says, I see so many details, but I can never just see the whole object that I'm looking at, and I'm wondering what this is and how to understand it.
Well, I had a student that had that problem, and she was not autistic. She was dyslexic, and I remember one time we were sitting at a traffic light next to this art store, and I say, Artarama, that's a funny name for store. And she said, all I saw was the A. And Tito describes this, and how can I talk, my lips don't move. Donna Williams, in her book, Autism, an Inside Out Approach, describes this problem. Now, I don't have this. This is where autism's very, very, very variable. It's real, real variable, and I don't have this problem. It's this is something that, not everybody on the spectrum has.
But that they can go to those resources and maybe learn some more about it and what to do about it. So Tito's book again.
That's right.
There's somebody who wrote in, and I'm unaware of this. Apparently, you are very good friends.
Somebody's at my door. I'm going to have to let them in. Just a minute.
Okay, we'll hold on. I'll let all the viewers know that who we're talking to right now is Temple Grandin. If you're just tuning in, she's joining us via phone, and she's answering parent questions that you guys have written in. And it's a very exciting opportunity for us to be able to talk with her, and we hope we'll have more opportunities to do this. So if you haven't written in a question for Temple Grandin, and you still want to do, because we keep a pool of them so that if we have the opportunity to talk to her again.
Sorry, this is where I don't multitask very well.
Oh, no, I thought you did very well. Are you kidding me?
Okay.
And we were just filling our viewers in on what was happening. So, but do you have a few more minutes to talk, Temple?
Yes, I do.
Okay, great. So somebody wrote in and said that you have, that you're good friends with somebody who's blind.
Yes.
And that their best friend is blind. And their question is, do you narrate and describe scenes with ease to the friend that's blind? And does that build trust between you? Because the person reports that they're very inspired by the fact that you also have a friend that's blind.
Well, she was my roommate, and we would used to go to movies, and we'd sit in the back row, and I would whisper to her what the visual parts of the movie.
How beautiful.
And then she had a radio that would pick up TV signals, and we used to watch Star Trek on her radio.
Oh, wonderful.
And Star Trek was pretty good on the radio because I knew what the visuals looked like.
And was it easy for you to describe those things to her?
Yes, that was very, very easy because I'm a total visual thinker.
There you go.
So it was very, very easy for me to describe the visuals to her.
What a gift to each other. You must have been.
She was the best roommate I ever had.
And Temple, is it easy for you to have friends? Is it something that you struggle with, or is it something that you're really adept at now?
Well, most of my friends are through shared interests. And one thing I really recommend to all the parents out there, get autistic kids or kids that have got whatever diagnosis they got, whatever labels on them, get them involved with things with shared interests. School play, band, school newspaper, art club, computer club, robotics, Future Farmers of America, 4-H. Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts. Get involved in activities where they have a shared interest.
I think that's great advice. We actually had a parent write in on Friday about having a teenager and how there aren't supports, but that she has him in a sailing club and a couple of other clubs.
Good.
And we had said, clubs are great. So she felt like maybe, but she's wanting something more. And I know you talked earlier about volunteering to get them ready for job skills. Is there anything else we should be focusing on with our teenagers?
Well, middle school, we need to start focusing on job skills. And volunteer work does count, and I think it needs to be work outside the home. It could be a tour guide, it could be clean the swimming pools, walk some dogs. People that live in the city live in an area where there's a lot of dogs around. Walking dogs is, as far as I'm concerned, that's a new paper route.
Okay.
We need to be giving these kids a job that's a lot like a paper route, where they got to do it every day and have that responsibility of doing it.
And does it need to be something that is in their area of interest, or it just is a job and they get paid for it? Or
sometimes it needs to just be a job. I don't think cleaning pools would be in anybody's interest.
Yeah.
But sometimes they just need to do a job.
Okay.
They need to learn how to work.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think for a lot of our kids on the autism spectrum, they have a really good work ethic, especially those that have had a great deal of ABA. They sort of get it, that my time is taken up doing this right now. But I do see that as you get into those teenage years, it gets a little bit rougher.
Well, I don't think, first of all, I watched a big, long talk with Kristen Smith, who's a specialist in ABA, and he said basically ABA is a little kids program, unless it's real severe autism. And you get most people on the higher end of the spectrum. I mean, they're beyond ABA.
Yeah.
We need to be, but they need to learn work skills.
Absolutely. We have a viewer who wants to know when you're coming back to Portland, Oregon.
I don't know. I don't have anything scheduled. Oh, wait a minute. I've got on my book tour. I've got some stuff scheduled. Wait a minute. I've got to see if I am coming to Portland. I know I'm coming into Seattle. Let me just look at my book tour schedule for the autistic brain. Let me just look. Portland on the 26th of June. I'll be at Powell's Bookstore on the 26th of June.
Okay, great. So that's when you will be in Portland.
Yeah, that's when I'll be in Portland.
I know you got a bunch of different events that are coming up, places that you're speaking. I know you're getting ready to speak in Dallas the week right before Easter. Is there anything else, a place that you're going that you'd like to tell our viewers about where they can get to meet you?
Well, I going to a lot of different places, and I'm not that good about getting everything up on the web page.
That's okay. I mean, people can search and I was able to see that you were going to be
I can tell you some of the places I'll be at for the book tour for the autistic brain.
Okay.
I will be on the 21st of May. I'll be at LA, Los Angeles, at the University at Riverside. Okay. And then on the 27th of May, I will be at the Los Angeles Public Library. And then I'll be in New York. I'll be in New York. They've got me on the 29th and the 30th, but I don't know where. I'll be in Washington, D.C. on the 1st of May. I'm not sure where yet. I'll be at LaSalle University outside of Philadelphia on the 3rd, also at the Philadelphia Public Library. Pensacola, Florida on the 14th of May. I'll be at an Asperger meeting. Oh, wait a minute, that's in Sydney, Australia. You don't want that.
Oh, yes, we have viewers that watch us in Australia.
Well, okay, I'll be Sydney, Australia, Asperger Association. That's going to be the 1st of June.
Okay.
And then San Francisco on the 5th of June and the 4th of June. 4th and 5th of June in San Francisco. Atlanta on the 19th of June.
You do get around, don't you, Temple? You're a very busy lady. You're racking up some miles.
I'll be at the Tattered Covered Bookstore in Denver on the 27th.
I love that store.
Okay, so that's some of the places I'll be at for the book tour for the autistic brain.
Okay.
And people can also, the publicist is Taryn Roeder at Houghton Mifflin.
Okay. So if people, that's a great opportunity for them to come and have an opportunity to meet and greet with you and get a book signed perhaps, and which is a lovely thing, because people do want to meet you, Temple. It's, you know, I was very excited to meet you about a month ago, and everyone was so excited to ask me about what it was like meeting you. And I got to say, it was one of the highlights of my life, Temple, to meet you.
Thank you.
Really remarkable. And since you're going to be in LA, maybe we could talk about, if you have an extra couple of minutes, we'd love to have you come into the studio.
Probably will not have time to do that.
All right. Well, I'll sacrifice that because we get time to talk to you on the phone from time to time. But one more question that I have for you, Temple, because I know you have to go, but we have a lot of people who've written in and asked questions about the teen years and about dealing with love interests. And
the teen years were the worst part of my life. And I would recommend that they get a book that I did with Sean Barron called The Unwritten Social Rules. I was the kind of teenager, I was a pure geek who wasn't interested in those things, where Sean was. And Sean didn't know how to deal with it. And most of the marriages where things have worked out well, it's been through shared interests. You know, two computer people or two people that like dogs or whatever their interest is. And also, they've got to learn the certain rules. You don't want to get busted for stalking.
Right.
You certainly don't want to get on a sex offender website.
Right.
There are some very, very strict rules. And the thing that's interesting is I'm very different from Sean. We were the same on sensory problems, fixated interests. That was all the same. But where we were different is Sean had so much more social interest than I do. And in that book, Sean tells his story in his words. I tell my story in my words. And then Veronica Zisk is the editor. And I think teens dealing with those kind of issues will find that book helpful.
Okay, and what's the name of the book again?
Unwritten Social Rules.
Okay.
And it's published by Future Horizons out of Texas.
Wonderful. Temple, I thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. And I hope that we'll have the opportunity to do it again in the coming months. And I look forward to hearing about all the different places that you're going to be, and we'll stay in touch.
That sounds great. Thank you
so much, Temple.
All right, you're welcome.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Temple, everybody's talking about this book. It's something that's very timely, especially for those of us who have kids that are teenagers or about to be teenagers. Tell our viewers what the new book is.
Well, Deborah Moore, a psychologist out in California, came to me with the idea of doing this book. And one of the big things we wanted to talk about is the problem of certain kids on the autism spectrum getting addicted to video games. And I'm seeing some very bad outcomes. You know, like he's 23 years old, he's in the basement playing video games, and he doesn't do anything else. And Deborah Moore put together a great chapter in the Loving Push on video games. We also have some very nice first-person profiles of people on the spectrum being successful in jobs, which is a really good positive thing. I can't emphasize enough the importance of kids getting jobs when they're in high school, even volunteer jobs at the church or anything. They've got to learn that discipline and responsibility of having a job. You've got to be there on time. You've got to be reliable. When I was 15 years old, I was cleaning horse stalls. When I was 13 years old, my mother got me a sewing job. I've seen too many smart kids on the spectrum that are not learning how to work.
Yeah, and I love the idea, Temple. You talk about this a lot, about how we can't just expect them to be ready for a job suddenly, miraculously, when they turn 18, that there's a whole process that we have to do to help them to be ready, and that we used to do this all the time, that I had to do jobs, odd jobs around the neighborhood well before I was at an age where I was eligible for a job. And you did as well, right?
Well, when I was 13, Mother got me a little sewing job, and when I was even younger, I'd washed a few cars. It's important to have a slow transition from the world of school to the world of work. I'm seeing too often where a child on the spectrum graduates from college, and he has never had a job of any kind of a job. And so if you have a kid in high school, I want to get him out working. He can be in the informal economy when he's young. As soon as he's 14, 16, I want him to get a real job just to learn work skills. If you have individuals in college right now, they need to be doing career relevant summer internships. I worked at a research lab. It was an unpaid internship where I did work on experiments on rats, actually, and mice. And I had to rent a house for another lady, and it was just set up in the neighborhood. They've got to learn working skills, and that ought to happen before they graduate from school.
Yeah. Well, I love the idea of internships, and you and I had an opportunity to talk a couple of weeks ago about summer camp situations, because I was sharing with you that I'm having a really hard time finding a summer camp that I think is advantageous for my son who's really into tech things. And you had some great ideas about making it happen in the neighborhood, and I wondered if you'd share some of that with our viewers.
Well, let's just look at things. You know, we have a huge shortage in this country right now of car mechanics and diesel mechanics. Well, maybe some retired mechanic needs to set up a small engine repair class to just do with middle school kids so they can find out engines are cool. You know, a lot of schools have taken out hands-on classes. Now, in Texas, I know at some of the places they're putting that back in again. But how are students going to find out what they want to do for a career if they're not exposed? I get asked all the time, how did I get interested in the cattle industry? Because I was exposed to cattle when I was 15. That's how I got interested in them.
Yeah, and so I love this idea of that if we can't find the camp, you were suggesting to me, make it happen myself. You really lit a fire in me and inspired me. And I think what a great idea. For families, though, and you talk about this, the loving push. This is not about being mean, but about being loving and caring. This is what we do to raise our kids. What do you suggest if a parent is sitting there this summer and they've got a 15-year-old, they're not quite sure how to go about getting their kid an odd job or getting something happening in the neighborhood? What do you suggest?
Well, Mother just found a sewing job. She just saw a sign on a lady's house that said, you know, freelance seamstress, and she just went in and offered up my skills. She knew I was good at hand sewing. It was just done in the neighborhood. The internship at the research lab was just done in the neighborhood. It's set up to the people that were there in the school and with my mother.
We're here at the show. We're really loving. There's a new show on the Oprah Winfrey Network that's called For Pete's Sake, and it's Holly Robinson Peete and her family. She's got a 17-year-old son who's on the spectrum, and in the most recent episode, both she and her husband took their son to businesses that they frequent and said to the business owner, hey, have you got something here for our child? Is there, can you show him what you do here? I just thought that was really proactive of them, that they didn't wait for somebody to approach them. They went to the business. Do you think that's a good idea?
That's the thing to do. I ask parents all the time, what do you know, shopkeepers, especially independent businesses, just do something in the neighborhood. And that sewing job is a perfect example of just setting it up in the neighborhood.
Yeah, and it seems, as you said, in high schools anymore, there used to be vocational training, and there isn't anymore. But so instead of waiting for the schools to bring it back, you had talked to me about the all-important lawnmower a couple of weeks ago, and how lawnmowers, old lawnmowers are around, and even learning how to repair a lawnmower is something that's a great skill for kids.
Well, it gets a kid interested in engines. He's going to find out that maybe engines interest him. And that lawnmower could then go on and turn into an auto mechanics class. See, the problem is that all of those vocational things have moved to the community college. But that's almost too late. We need to be getting these kids hooked on some of these skilled trades and vocational things before they graduate from high school.
Absolutely, absolutely. And then I wondered if we could take just a second to talk with you, Dr. Grandin, about inclusion and how you feel about, there's a big push right now that a lot of schools have started specific programs that are just for kids with autism, where they're putting them someplace else on campus. Likewise,
now, what age of kids are you talking about?
I'm talking about junior, from kindergarten all the way up through high school. And then there are other schools that are making a big push for inclusion, having everybody in the classroom together. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts about either of those models.
Well, sometimes the correct thing to do for a particular kid is something in between. But I'll tell you something I don't want to see. I walk into a brand new autism school, and you got 4 or 5 very severely handicapped kids in a room, and then they're sitting amongst them as a 12-year-old that should definitely not be there, fully verbal, just messing around on a computer. He maybe possibly should be in a gifted class. That's what I don't want to see. See, autism is turned into such a broad spectrum that I'm seeing too many of the Asperger type of kids held behind when they ought to be working for NASA. I've talked to a lot of people at NASA. I know there's people there that are sort of mildly on the spectrum. So one kind of geeky kid gets to go work for NASA or Google, and another geeky kid's playing video games in the basement on Social Security, and they're the same geeky kid.
Yeah.
See, I don't get hung up on the labels. I'm seeing the people. I see them as I talk about it.
Yeah, I gotta say, I think that you got such an insight in this area, Dr. Grandin, and I would love to see some of these programs spring up that can fill this gap in a way that's really affordable for families. I think that an industrious parent knows how to get this started, but there are a lot of parents that probably need some help getting these things started. And if
well, they just sort of, the other thing I'd say on is, I've worked for 20 years in the construction industry. I would design a project, then I'd supervise its construction. And one thing I learned is, how do you get things done? Like, if you ran out of parts, we got on the phone and called. Now today, you get on the internet and search, they have found the parts. There's an urgency. How do you get it done?
Yeah. It's the problem solving that I think is missing. We talk about teaching critical thinking in high schools and junior highs, but if it's not practical and hands-on, I don't know that the lesson really gets taught.
Well, hands-on things. I remember in sewing, and I loved sewing when I was in elementary school, and I cut some fabric wrong in a wrecked project. And I learned from that you don't rush. Some other time you might make a mistake, and then you just have to figure out some other way to do it. When I made bird kites that I flew behind my trike when I was really little, I experimented with these bird kites. Hands-on things teach practical problem solving. And I think a lot of people today don't know how to do practical problem solving because they haven't done any hands-on things.
Yeah, no, it's true. And a lot of times, I love that the book talks about how we're going to have to push our kids, because I think a lot of people, myself included, I have coddled my kid. You pointed that out to me this fall. We went to lunch together, and I was not letting my son use the restroom by himself, and you went up one side of me and down the other, and he's very grateful to you, Dr. Grandin.
And you know what? He just got right up and he used it.
He did, and whenever I'm being too much of a smother now, he threatens to call you, because he knows that you're on his side, and that's good. I think parents need that.
And I knew that at that barbecue restaurant, that restaurant was going to be perfectly safe.
Yes, and he had such a good time with you that day, I have to say. Now, I wonder, as we're getting ready to be in April, Autism Awareness Month, and a lot of people are going to be talking about autism, and already this week there's been a lot in the news talking about autism, and there's a discussion about what the discussion should be. And I'd like to hear from you, Dr. Grandin, about what do you think the discussion about autism should be right now?
Well, I'm very concerned about how broad the spectrum is, and I don't want to see a smart, geeky kid who maybe should work for Google going down the wrong track. You see, the problem is when you just think about it in language, you get locked into the label. See, one advantage of being a visual thinker is I see a geeky kid at a gifted conference, then I go over to an autism conference, they're the same geeky kid. And then I go to a tech company and I see 10 years older, it's the same kind of geeky kid. I want to see them get into those good jobs. And then you've got another end of the spectrum where they're very severely handicapped. They're not going to work for Google. You see, this is the problem we've got with the autism diagnosis. It's so broad.
Yeah.
Going from someone who remains with very severe handicaps to somebody that ought to be in a gifted program, but they're socially awkward. This is one of the things that's a real problem. Now, when it comes to early intervention, that's one place where that's really improved. You've got 3-year-olds that are not talking, you've got to start working on that kid and working on him right now.
Yeah, I so agree with you about the huge wide spectrum. And I know I promised you that we weren't going to keep you very long, so I want to thank you for being with us. We're going to close out of the recording, but then I'm going to ask you to stay on the line with me for just one quick second when we're done. But thank you so much. And And just a last question for you, Dr. Grandin. Do you do anything particular in the month of April to commemorate Autism Awareness Month?
I've got a ton of speaking engagements.
Well, and that is such a great service to our community. You always enlighten us, you always lift us up, and we thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Here with Dr. Jonathan Tarbox live in the studio, and he is the head of research and development at the Center for Autism and Related Disorders, and I've asked him to stay with me because joining us via Skype right now live is the wonderful Dr. Temple Grandin, and of course those of you who are watching are probably very familiar with her. She is a hero in our community. She is a wonderful author and speaker and advocate. Temple, thank you so much for being with us here today.
It's great to be here.
Now, you are in Indianapolis right now. You just this morning gave your keynote speech at the Autism Society of America's annual conference, and I heard that it was incredible, that it was absolutely life-changing, and I'm just so thrilled that you're willing to take the time to be with us now. We've asked some of our viewers, who are largely parents, to write in some questions for you, and I'm going to start with one that's about a 6-year-old. The mom writes in and says, he's about to be 6 years old, excuse me. My almost 6-year-old son has an interest in storms and weather, specifically tornadoes. We're at the tip of Tornado Alley, so it's not unlikely to have a threat, but so far he's never been in immediate danger. Although it seems to be a special interest, it sometimes causes a lot of anxiety and irrational fears. For example, he has claimed to be the only one who can see invisible tornadoes approaching, even when they are factually not signs or warnings of danger. I try to support him in learning about storms, hoping the more he learns, the less anxiety he will have. Do you have any thoughts on where to go with this and if I'm headed in the right direction?
Well, kids oftentimes have irrational fears. My irrational fear at 6 was Mr. Woolworth, the black cement mixer drum. And Mr. Woolworth lived under the bed, and I was afraid that if I put my foot over the bed, he'd roll out and suck me up.
Wow.
Well, that just didn't make any sense. And when I was also that age, they were building a new addition on our house, and they had this big circular saw in their shed, and I somehow worried the blade might come up through the floor. But then I ended up working with the building trades. So something that, he gets a little older, learn about storms. That's probably a good thing, and some of the precautions that you can take against storms. But when I was his age, I had, these were Mr. Woolworth, a cement mixer drum, a black one, rather strange fear. I certainly don't have that now. Okay. And we did lots of things with cement mixers on my construction projects.
And so do you think it's a good idea for her to encourage learning more about them?
If you do it the right way, like precautions you can take during a storm, for example, like where you would go if there, a tornado might be coming. I used to be, when I was older, airplane. High school, we had to make an emergency landing and go down the slides. And I was a white knuckle flyer all through college. And what helped me was how airplanes fly.
Okay, and we're having a little bit of sticking. I think if you can hear me, and if John, if you can hear me there, we're going to take a short break and see if we can strengthen the signal a little bit, because we're just having a little bit of
I don't know how to strengthen the signal, but...
Well, Emily's going to try just calling you back. So, because we want to be able to hear all of this, because this is good information. So we're going to go very quickly to a break, and we're going to come back. We're going to try calling again, see if we can get a little bit better signal. Everybody keep your fingers crossed to the Skype gods. Skype is our friend. Skype is our friend. All right, we'll be right back after this message.
I'm going to power my phone.
Welcome back to Autism Live. We have with us right now via Skype Temple Grandin, and here in the studio we have Dr. Jonathan Tarbox. We're talking with Temple Grandin. She
She is in Indianapolis. She earlier this morning gave her keynote address at the Autism Society of America, and it just brought the house down. So we're so thrilled to have this time with her. We were having a little bit of technical difficulty. Before we left, Temple, you were talking about when you were in high school and talking about your fear of airplanes. And so if you'd like to pick that up there where we were talking about that and let us know what you were saying.
I got a lot of anxiety. When I got into puberty, I started having a lot of anxiety. And when I was a senior in high school, I was in an airplane. It was like my third flight in my life, and I had to make they made an emergency landing when we went down the slides. So all through college, I was terrified of airplanes. And one of the things that helped me to get over that was learning more about how airplanes worked. Because the pilot would put the landing gear down, and I was sure the bottom of the plane was falling out. You know, when you learn more about something, then it makes it a whole lot less scary. It makes it a whole lot less scary, and that's something that's worked well with people that have elevator phobias. When they start learning about the mechanisms that the elevator has, that will prevent it from crashing down the shaft.
I kind of have some elevator phobias. I think I'm going to go learn how they work. I love that advice, Temple. That's really wonderful. Now, somebody else wants to know, were you aware that you were different or unique? And then they additionally want to know, have you had visual stims, and what is the thought process behind those stims?
I did not do visual stims. Most of my sensory problems were touch sensitivity, especially scratchy clothes, and problems with loud noise. Autism sensory problems are extremely variable, but I've read accounts in the literature like Titos, How Can I Talk? Donna Williams' book, Somebody Somewhere, where she describes almost kind of a Picasso-like vision where visual images break up. There's a problem in the circuits that assemble the image file on the back of the brain. And some people that have those problems are helped with the Erlen colored lenses, different pale colored glasses. I know a lot of people that have gone down to the local sunglass store, picked out some light lavenders or light tans or some light pinks, and it's helped them with reading because the print stops jiggling on the page. But again, some will have a visual problem, others do not have it. These things are extremely variable.
Well, I'm curious, Temple, because I remember talking to you once before, and you talked about two things that you really did enjoy doing when you were young: spinning a metal plate on your bed and letting sand fall through your fingers. And I remember asking you about what it was why you wanted to do that so much, and maybe you could talk to us about what is the thought process behind when there's something that you want to do. What was it about spinning the plate, and what was it about the sand? I would have assumed it was visual, but now I'm wondering if it wasn't.
Well, I love to watch visual things. People that have problems with the visual system avoid visually stimulating things. I actually liked them. My favorite toys were airplanes and kites, things that were visually interesting to look at. I loved flags. And when I dribbled the sand through my hands, I liked to study every little rock, sort of like a scientist with a microscope. And when I spun this brass plate that covered up a bolt that held the bed frame together, I would spin it at different speeds, then see how many times it would rotate and how it would stop rotating. It was almost sort of like a scientist testing it, looking at every different way I could spin it.
Wow. It's always so wonderful to hear your perspective on things, because that wouldn't have occurred to me. So I appreciate as a parent knowing that. Okay, I want to go on to, somebody wants to know, what was your favorite horse of all time? And they want to know why that particular horse was your favorite.
Well, when I was in high school, a horse I rode all the time I really liked was Bay Lady. It's just brown with black mane and tail. I showed her in shows, spent a lot of time getting her ready for shows. And this brings up an important thing: social interaction through shared specialized interests. The only place I was not bullied and teased in high school was specialized interests: horseback riding, electronics lab, and rocket club.
Wonderful. And so was one of those your favorite, or did you like those all equally?
Well, horses when I was in high school was my absolute big favorite, but I also really liked the science stuff too. I remember one really cool visually stimulating project we did. Took great big audio speakers, and we stretched a rubber membrane across those speakers, and then we glued pieces of broken mirror to it. And when you play the music, you reflect the light off of it, and it makes patterns on the wall or on the ceiling. Very cool, 60s science project, still a cool thing to do today to make sound waves visual. Very simple, very inexpensive.
Wonderful. It sounds really exciting. Another question that we've got here, somebody wants to know, are there any tips you can give me when I take my son to the local trampoline park? My son has a trampoline in his room and uses it for hours. He's a sensory seeker. The whistles, loud kids, and music are overwhelming for him. He blocks out sound by covering his ears and making loud noises, which I can handle, but the other kids and the parents do stare. So he can do the trampoline at home, but she'd like to take him and socialize at the trampoline park, but there's too much sensory going on for him there. What would you advise?
Well, there's a new treatment that's just been published. There's a paper out on the internet. It's a refereed, evidence-based journal article, and it's called Environmental Enrichment is an Effective Treatment for Autism. Use keywords on Google, environmental enrichment autism. Use those 3 keywords. And the principle of this method is it's based on stimulating 2 senses at once, and the foundation of it is the so-called primitive senses of smell, touch, and balance. Like you might be smelling lavender while touching some sandpaper, or you're rubbing the kid's back and you're smelling another smell. Another basic principle is always changing the stimuli. And there's therapy, 8 different aromatherapies, rotating those, but always stimulating 2 senses. The paper is a free download. And I had one parent write to me that they tried some of these things, and it helped their daughter tolerate a really noisy, awful classroom that her class had just been moved into.
Fascinating. And so tell me again the name of it, Temple?
The title of the paper is Environmental Enrichment is an Effective Treatment for Autism.
Okay, great.
You cannot remember the title. 3 keywords: environmental, enrichment, autism.
Okay, great. I'm going to move on to the next question here. If your child is a visual and auditory learner and has mastered language arts, but math is like he cannot master, what do you do? What approach is best to help him? Getting stuck on multiplication and not moving past it is hard.
Okay, I hit the wall at algebra. And the mistake that was made in my math education was not going on to geometry. And the only way I got through college is, thank goodness, in '67, algebra was not the required course then. It was finite math. I think with something like multiplication, I actually had no problem with that. Try making it more concrete. One of the things that helped me was to understand that multiplication is a form of adding. So you might want to take a whole lot of pennies and make sure you only use pennies. Let's say 5 times 6. We'll lay out your grid. 5 pennies across, 6 pennies up, and you lay out 30 pennies. And then you start to get the idea that it's actually a form of adding. And then I also just memorized my old-fashioned multiplication tables.
Wonderful. You know, we recently had your mom on the show, and it was such a delight to talk with your mom. And she has so many wonderful things to say about you and stories to share. She's just a wonderful, wonderful resource. So is that the way your mom did it with you? She just worked on the rote memorization, or did she get out pennies?
No, well, someone at some point, I think maybe the teacher at school did the pennies, but they did some of those things with me. Another thing, my mother had a really good sense of just how much to stretch me and push me. There's a tendency for these kids to get over-shouldered. They're not learning how to shake hands. And when I was a young child, around 7 or 8, I had to be party hostess at my mother's parties, and I loved it because I got to greet all the grown-ups, practice my grown-up skills, saying, please and thank you, and serve them the snacks. And I need to do those simple things, teach these skills.
Absolutely. We've got a question from a 16-year-old on the spectrum who wants to know if you have any advice. He would like very much to meet a girl and have a girlfriend and is overwhelmed with how to figure out how to do that.
I think he's most likely to meet a girlfriend through a shared interest. It could be robotics, it could be computers, it could be working in theater on the school play, music, band, an art club. Get involved with the shared interests, because some of the best marriages are where there's a shared Then for a book that I did with Sean Barron called The Unwritten Social Rules. He might find that really helpful, but approach it through this route.
Okay, wonderful. We've got somebody who wants to know if you are still teaching and how long you plan on continue teaching.
I still am teaching. I plan to keep teaching until I can no longer walk or do anything anymore. And I'm happy to say that one of my other colleagues at Colorado State University, who's 10 years older, is now teaching quarter time at 2 different universities, and he's teaching the introductory, some of the introductory animal science classes.
Okay, a parent wants to know, what is the best advice you can give young women when they're feeling as if, she says that there's so many boys who have autism and our girls feel alone. Did you feel that way, and what advice do you give to our girls on the spectrum?
Well, when I was a teenager, I was more worried about teasing and bullying, and when I was starting out in my business, the worst thing was all the, discrimination against girls. I mean, I was going into a man's industry. That was not an easy thing. The HBO movie showed a lot of that stuff, and the movie did show that accurately. Sometimes I think there gets to be too much emphasis on the autism, because one of the things that really helped me was getting interested in something I could turn into a career. I get asked, how did I get interested in cattle? I was exposed to them when I was 15. That was going out to my aunt's ranch. I almost didn't go to my aunt's ranch. My mother gave me a choice. She could say, well, you can go for a week, and if you don't like it, you can come back, or you can stay all summer. I got out there, and I loved it. She wasn't going to let not going at all be the choice. There's a choice, but not going wasn't going to be one of the choices.
I love that. So smart. Okay, I've got a long question here. I've seen many different resources claiming anywhere between 60 to 93% of communication is nonverbal communication. Is there a reliable study you can cite to show this? The school and state offices keep referring to communication as verbal language. I have had to constantly challenge the incorrect assumption that because my child has a lot of verbal language, he has no communication deficits. Though he has so many, even his emotional vocabulary and abstract language is lagging, as well as body language, eye contact, gestures, behavior challenges due to miscommunication, etc. I am now in the process of challenging the state for denial of funding and would like to be as articulate as I can for this and for future advocacy. So is there anything that you're aware of, Temple, that they can point to that shows that nonverbal communication is very important and a deficit in that needs to be addressed?
Well, I had to learn all that stuff, by, it's like coaching an actor in a play. Things that are instinctual for most people are not instinctual for me. I had to learn if somebody crosses their arms like this at a project meeting, that they're probably not too receptive to what I had to say to them, or someone's rolling their eyes. I had to learn what those things meant. And some of the most helpful things for me were some of the first-person accounts, that I read, and there's a lot of those out there. Nonverbal communication is really important. And when I was younger, old-fashioned voice phone was my favorite way of communicating, because I came across a lot. I was much more normal-like and less weird on the phone because they didn't see my mannerisms. Didn't have Skype when my business started. Old-fashioned voice phone, loved it.
Absolutely. And now texting is such a thing. Do you feel like texting is something that helps us communicate or hinders communication?
I think it's hindering communication to a certain amount, because I've talked to a lot of people that hire a lot of people at various businesses, and they say, well, these young people don't know how to communicate. And I went to an interesting talk at a business meeting. Today's teenagers have a prolonged adolescence, a shortened childhood, prolonged adolescence. And it's going to take longer for them to grow up and learn some of the communication things they need to learn at work. Also, I want to talk about the importance of learning work skills. That needs to start at 12 years old. When I was 13 years old, mother set me up a sewing job 2 afternoons a week. When I was 15, I cleaned 8 horse stalls every day. When I was in college, I did career-relevant internships, like working in a research lab one summer. We've got to set these things up. Short-circuit that interview process. You got to grease the skids in the background and just get them into these jobs.
I love
Tell
that.
the boss it's going to take longer to train them, but they'll be really good when you get them trained.
Wonderful. And you know, Dr. Grandin, we have with us in the studio Dr. Jonathan Tarbox, who is the director of the Autism Research Group. They're an organization that does research about things having to do with behavior that can actually help parents who are treating a child right now. And one of the things that they frequently do is they ask parents, what would you like to see research done on? I'm wondering for you, is there anything that's on your wish list of what research should be done?
I think some of the most important research is on sensory, because sensory problems vary from being very, very debilitating and stop people from participating in normal activities. In fact, in my new book, The Autistic Brain, got a big, extensive section on sensory issues, but that would be one of my top priority things. And we need to work on sensory subtyping. Some kids have visual problems. Well, and the visual problems don't tend to be the artists and the industrial designers because their brains pixelate in the images. You know, then you've got people with a lot of sound sensitivity issues or the taste sensitivity, but start looking at this not just as autism, but okay, this person has problems with the fluorescent lights, visual problems, somebody else has sound sensitivity, and there has been some research that shows that the loud noises actually turn on the fear center. Yep, I can relate to that, but we need to be doing some sensory subgrouping and then figuring out how to treat these things.
Yeah, I love that, Dr. Grandin, that you're pointing that out, because we've definitely, you know, in your typical ABA program, we treat all of these kids, right? And we're all kind of aware of these sensory issues, but honestly, they're just not dealt with to a sufficient degree. And so you'll see, you know, you'll ask a child to do some kind of learning task, and, you know, for the same task that seems pretty reasonable to you or me, you know, 5 different kids on the spectrum might have 5 completely different reactions to that task, especially if it involves loud noises, or if it's in a loud classroom with too many visual distractions, or if the materials that you're using are too strange of a texture, or rice or sand or something for the child who's afraid of textured materials touching their hands, and so it kind of gets swept under the rug, right? If we don't actually address those things individually.
Well, we need to be doing this, and I was very excited about this environmental enrichment method, because this paper uses all easy things. You don't have to buy a lot of fancy equipment. I mean, they were using things like sandpaper, carpet, you know, some aromatherapy stuff, music CD on classical music, just simple things, warm and cold spoons for touch and temperature stimulation, just very, very simple things.
Fascinating. I'm wondering, Dr. Grandin, you mentioned that loud noises were something that were frightening to you. What do you think helped you to get to the point where you could manage that?
Well, let the child control the noise. Okay, one of the worst is microphone feedback. Okay, give the child a handheld wireless mic. He starts to walk up to the speaker, and just when he goes, he can back off. Where he controls it. He can turn it on and he can stop it. That's one of the things. Or let's say the kid can't tolerate going to the big supermarket because it's too noisy. Well, you let him control how much big supermarket he has to tolerate, and then when he can't stand it, he can give you a signal and you'll take him out. In other words, give the child control of the thing he finds totally nasty, and then sometimes that can help desensitize it.
Well, we're running out of time with you, Dr. Grandin, but I wanted to take just one last minute at the end. You're there at the conference for the Autism Society of America. You gave the keynote speech this morning. They've got a lineup of really incredible things for people to participate in this week. And I wondered if you could speak to why, I know you're so busy, but you made the time to go to this conference. If you could talk a little bit about the Autism Society of America and why you felt it was really important to be there with those folks this morning.
Well, the Autism Society of America has a lot of chapters and affiliates that get out and communicate with a lot of people. Another big message that I talked about was build on strengths. Some kids are visual thinkers. You know, an artistic kind of career would be where they would want to go. That my ability in art showed up when I was in 3rd and 4th grade. Other little kids are going to be mathematicians. They could go into the computer programming field. We got to work on building strengths. Other kids are writers. And some people are going to think I'm just an old fogey when I talk about video games. But I'm seeing way too many kids getting so addicted to video games, they're not going anywhere. I'm not suggesting banning them, but we need to limit that to an hour a day.
Well, and I appreciate that advice. The first time that I met you, you told me about Khan Academy and suggested that I get my son started in Khan Academy. And this summer, he's been taking a class on Khan Academy to learn JavaScript so that he can animate things on the computer. And he's 11 years old, and it's really been transformative. So I have to thank you, and I want you to know that I'm letting others know about that. Your great advice about Khan Academy. It's free, and it's been a wonderful, wonderful resource.
Well, that's absolutely wonderful that they're teaching JavaScript. That's a really important thing to learn. We've got to start figuring out how to use these free tools to give people skills they're going to need for jobs. Because one thing about the computer science field is you show employers the right portfolio, you're going to get hired.
That's
and
right.
how did I sell cattle jobs? I showed off portfolios of my work, my drawings, my photos. Now today you find, put it on your phone. One thing that just drives me crazy is this kid will say, I got great drawing skills, or I know how to do all this programming stuff. I said, do you have it on your phone? Because you never know where you're going to meet the person that can open the door. Like
Good point.
On the bus stop, at the supermarket, on an airplane. You never know.
Love it. As always, Dr. Grandin, you shed such a light in a place that we're all looking to shed some light. We thank you so much for your time and for being the outspoken advocate that you are for our entire community.
Well, I want to see people get out and be successful. And I also want to emphasize the DSM changes have made autism into this huge, broad spectrum, going all the way from people that be working at Silicon Valley, Einstein, who had no language till age 3, to somebody that remains nonverbal with a lot more severe handicaps. And it's difficult lots of times for teachers to shift gears between those different levels.
I agree.
That's true.
I agree. Well, we thank you so much. We know that you've got a lot to do today and that you're still at that conference, the Autism Society of America. I want to encourage people that if they're in the area, they should be there at the conference. But thank you so much for being a part of the show today. We will let you get back to what you're doing, but thank you for being with us.
It was great to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Welcome back, everybody. It's World Autism Awareness Day, and we have with us in the studio Joanne Lara from Autism Works Now. We have with us on Skype Anita Lesko, and we have with us on the phone the fabulous, the wonderful Dr. Temple Grandin. First of all, Dr. Grandin, welcome back to Autism Live.
It's great to be here.
Thrilled to have you here, and Anita is here too. You guys have a book that is out today, written by Anita, but it's about you. It's Temple Grandin, The Stories That I Tell My Friends. I got to start, Temple, with asking you, why did you choose Anita Lesko to write this book about you?
Well, I think we kind of just took each other. Anita, thought of the idea of doing it, and one thing I really admired Anita for is the fact that came from a very poor background, and she started out working at a skating rink and at concession stands, and now is a very successful nurse anesthetist at the hospital. And she had kind of a work history, sort of like me, doing a lot of different kinds of odd jobs. I was painting signs when I first started. That's how I learned how to do freelance work, and then that morphed on into my cattle work.
Well, and obviously the two of you share a similar sense of humor because there's so many things in the book that are funny. How did you guys realize that because you guys laugh a lot on the phone, I hear?
Well, we just, got to talking about different things, and maybe, we just liked a lot of the same stuff. And one thing that really interested me was how some of our stuff on our work history was so similar. Anita and I both cleaned horse stalls as a teenager. And she cleaned horse stalls in order to get riding lessons. And when I was cleaning horse stalls and running a horse barn, I was learning how to work, which was really important.
Wow. And so, Anita, I want you to chime in here. This was a fabulous opportunity for you to get to spend time on the phone with Temple. I started asking you before, but I never really got to it. What's the one thing that you found out about Temple that you didn't know before?
Well, there's so many things. I'm going to think about that for a minute. I mean, there's so many things. I think some of her childhood things were the things that surprised me most, that she just was like every other kid doing fun kid things. And I used to envision her walking on the beach when she found the message in the bottle that she was very excited about, and she started writing messages and putting them in bottles and tossing them out into the ocean. I thought that was a really fun thing, just to hear her talking about her childhood days.
Well, I had, my elementary school childhood was really good, and we used to do a lot of stuff on the beach. I'd collect shells, and then we'd make mosaics out of them. Another childhood thing that my sister and I had rock collections when we were young. We used to smash rocks open and see what they looked like inside. But I was so happy when I got the message in a bottle, and then I started, throwing messages out there in bottles, and I would get about half of them back. I thought that was great fun.
It was a fascinating part of the book. I was saying to Anita before that there was one thing in particular that I was shocked by, and I don't know if it's okay for you to talk about it here on the show, but I was fascinated by the exchange that you had with B.F. Skinner.
Skinner. I knew you were going to say that.
So I can talk about that on the show. I was an undergraduate psychology major at the time, and I wrote to Skinner, and he invited me to his office. And it was like going into to see the god of psychology. And I go in, and there's an old professor there, and I had on a dress at that time, and he asked me if I could touch he could touch my legs. And I said, you may look at them, but you may not touch them. And that was the end of that. I remember another thing with him, and I did write about this in my book, Animals in Translation. I said, B.F. Skinner, we need to learn about the brain. He says, we don't need to learn about the brain. We have operant conditioning. Well, I never believed that. And then years later, when Skinner got a stroke, he realized that maybe he did have to look inside the box after all.
How's that for karma? In this year of the woman and this year of the UN General, them saying that this year the focus is going to be on women and girls on the autism spectrum, but it's also been the year of Me Too. And to hear you talk about B.F. Skinner, I just have to say, I have to applaud you, Temple, for saying to him, no, you can look, but you cannot touch.
That's exactly what I told him.
Was he surprised?
I talked to somebody just recently about it that worked with B.F. Skinner years ago, and they said, oh, yeah, that's B.F. That's the kind of stuff he did.
Shocking. But what was his expression when you said that to him, Temple? Was he shocked that you said no?
It totally ended it. And then after that, we went and toured his rat lab, and we got to talking about research.
Well, I loved how you did.
I was kind of shocked that the great BF did that.
And I loved how you talked about how it instantly, you went up to that building thinking that you were going to see somebody larger than life, and it instantly changed him in your mind.
Oh, yeah, that big vine that went all around his office. And he looked just like a regular professor. It was sort of like finding Oz behind the curtain.
There you go. I love that. And Anita, were you shocked to hear this story?
I'm never really shocked when I hear stories about men doing things like that. I found it actually very entertaining. But back then, in that day, he was actually before his time to do something like that. But actually, I was very impressed. Had I been in a situation and the guy said that to me, I probably would have been sort of speechless. I love Temple's comeback. You may look at them, but you may not touch them. I thought that was really slick.
I love that.
Really calmly and quietly and very slightly, because I was trained to always be polite.
Well, and you were polite, but you had that firm boundary. I was impressed. I want for all of our young women to hear that. I thought that that was absolutely...
And you know what? It ended it. Now, the situation where this stuff really gets to be a problem, I had a situation in one of my very early freelance jobs where there was a ranch foreman who wanted to have sex with me, and he was slapping me on the butt, and I pushed him off. And then, of course, he goes and tells the boss that the corrals that I designed for him did not work. See, the situation where you absolutely cannot deal with this is when it's a boss. B.F. Skinner was not my boss. He did not do my grades. Whereas this other guy was able to sabotage the project. You see, when it's a boss at work, that is a situation that just absolutely can be career-wrecking.
And so what did you do, Temple?
It was a real problem because he told the rancher, this guy was a foreman on the ranch, that the corrals didn't work. And I almost thought, well, I'm going to just have to give up designing corrals. But thank goodness that wonderful Jim, the contractor who had built the corrals, he was another really important inventor for me. He seeked me out to design corrals for him. And he, supported me and says, no, I want you to keep designing stuff for me. But that was a situation, you see, where it was a boss doing it to me on a job. And that was much more difficult to deal with than the B.F. Skinner thing. B.F. Skinner was not my boss.
Absolutely. Now, Jim figures pretty largely in the book. He's somebody that you knew for a long time and that really you collaborated with a lot.
Well, Jim had seen some of my drawings, and he actually seeked me out. He wanted to get started in designing corrals, and he really helped me get my business started. He was one of the really important mentors out in the industry. I mean, he was a man that really helped me a whole lot. He built my projects, but I also helped him. Now he's doing big, gigantic projects now for the Department of Transportation in Arizona and military bases and all sorts of things. But he was just a little tiny company in a little teeny small office in his house when he started. So we both helped each other.
Well, but you've helped a lot of people, and I love that it's one of the things, Anita, that you featured in the book. Let's talk a little bit about some of the things that you were impressed with, Anita, ways that Temple has helped others.
Well, one of the things that I found out at Temple's birthday party was when I learned that Temple pays for her graduate students full entire tuition and enables them to get their PhD in the animal science under her, instruction and tutelage. And I was so shocked at that. There's so many people that I've known in my lifetime, or you read about, that are, have the means to do that, and they would never do anything like that. I was just so, Temple wants to continue on this whole, the animal handling and everything, the way she teaches it, and wants it to continue on, and that's what's it's so spectacular. When that was very shocking, very thrilling thing for me to hear that when I learned that.
Yeah, Temple, was this a secret? Because I don't think anybody knew this.
No, it's not secret. I'm just not the kind of person to flaunt stuff.
Because you're so spectacular. But you've helped other people along the way.
I've put a lot of students through graduate school.
Amazing. And when I was saying earlier that my favorite part of the book was hearing about your friend Mark, and obviously you did a lot of things to help him along his way.
Well, let me tell you, Mark was a farrier, a horseshoer. He came to me in the early 90s, and he had a theory about the temperament of horses and the hair whorls that are in the middle of horses' heads. And he had observed during horseshoeing that a horse that had high hair whorls, way up high on the forehead, maybe a set of double hair whorls, a lot more flighty. And he had gone to several universities, and they had just turned him down. They thought that was crazy. He came to me, and I said, well, let's work on this, but instead of horses, let's do cattle. They have exactly the same kind of hair whorls. So we did a study. We went out to a feed yard and looked at 1,500 head of cattle, and we ranked them on how much they got agitated in the squeeze chute. And the animals that tended to get agitated when they're held in the squeeze chute had higher hair whorls. And also at that same time, we were doing some of the early first work on cattle temperament. Now, I had a student named Bridget Blazonnet, and Bridget did a study where we found that cattle that are really wild and get agitated when you handle them had lower weight gains. And 20 years ago, that was real radical stuff. Now, everybody's temperament testing cattle. It's not industry practice, but in 1996 and 97, paper was published. That was the real pioneering stuff.
Well, and I found it fascinating that you go on to talk about this study in the book. Anita had included it in the book because it's fascinating. And that one of the things that you both discovered was that if you treated those cattle and those horses slightly differently, that they were better performers.
That's right. See, what you have to do with a horse that's really flighty is you got to make sure you don't traumatize them. You take a horse like an Arab that's very sensitive. If you beat it up, that animal almost, I think, gets a PTSD and it doesn't get over it. You can take an animal that's got a calmer temperament, force it to do something, get away with it. But you take that animal that's a really sensitive, high fear temperament, and you treat it right. Some of those are some of the most intelligent horses. Yes.
Well, and of course, that seemed very familiar to me with the autism community. That maybe a different way of learning, a different approach, but sometimes the intelligence is so much higher. Don't you both agree?
I've talked about autism. What we said that autism in the mild forms is just part of normal human variation. A brain can be more thinking, or a brain can be more social, emotional, and there's a certain range that's just going to be, normal variation. And I found a really interesting paper that came out in 2018, where scientists have been looking at genes involved with autism, and they're all brain development genes. And basically, what scientists are learning is that the genes that cause autism and schizophrenia are the same genes that give human beings a very large brain, and that autism is rapid early growth, too much, and schizophrenia is not enough later growth, and it involves the same things. In fact, I recently did some real fancy genomics testing, and I found out exactly why I have a genetic defect, why I have small teeth, I've got thin nails that break off, my skin's a mess. But it actually told me very, very little about the autism genes. There's a whole list of them, and each one contributes a little bit, and that's exactly how brain development genes would work.
It's all so fascinating. I want to encourage people, they need to get this book. I just think it's a lovely book. Obviously you've read the book now, right, Temple?
Oh, absolutely. I got a lot of my NASA pictures in there. I did a fabulous trip to NASA. I got to see a SpaceX launch. I got to sit in the launch director's chair where they did the moon shot. It was a total NASA geek out. Got lots of pictures of me at NASA in the book, in stories I tell my friends. That was so much fun. The thing I learned when I went to NASA, and I've been to NASA also in Houston. And
I was with you on that trip.
Lab, the right stuff rolled the rockets, but the geeks and the nerds and the misfits and the people with mild autism and dyslexia and every other label, they built the stuff.
That's right. That's right. And I wished I thought of it, because I have a bunch more pictures of you when we went to Houston together to NASA, Temple, that I wished I'd given them to Anita, because I've got a bunch of pictures, but I'll share those with you, Temple.
Well, we got some really good pictures.
They're
took
wonderful.
At Cape Kennedy, and took a lot of, going to a real launch is so exciting compared to watching it on TV. We got to get kids out doing real things.
I agree.
Yes.
Now you're breaking up just a little bit, Temple, and
okay,
I wanted.
I've got another book coming out called Calling All Minds. It's about famous inventors and all the things that I made when I was a child, and I'd spent hours and hours tinkering and making things.
I love that. I want to take just a second here, because we've had a bunch of people writing in questions. Somebody wrote in and said 2 questions for Temple about how to learn to work and get a job, and how to learn to drive a car.
All right, I definitely want to talk about how to learn work and how to drive. I can answer those really easily. You want me to do that right now?
Yes, please.
Okay, driving. It's going to take longer. In order to deal with the problem of the multitasking, the person with autism has to learn the operation of the car before we do any traffic. Driver's ed throws them in way too quickly. I learned to drive on my aunt's ranch, where it was 3 miles up to the mailbox, 3 miles back, and by the time I did that all summer, I had done 200 miles of driving. Then we did traffic. So what I recommend is spend 20 minutes a day in a completely safe place, like a giant parking lot, back roads, learning how to operate the car before we do any traffic at all, maybe even before you do driver's ed, because they throw them in way too quickly. That's my main thing on driving. It's going to take longer. And then on learning how to work. The kids that are, coming of age now, when they're in middle school, they need to be doing volunteer jobs. It's really important to start doing jobs outside the home on a schedule. Now, in some states, you can do regular jobs at 14, others at 16. Let's get 2 real jobs under that belt before they graduate. I would like to get rid of the problems with the transition. I'd like the transition to work done. Because when you look at a lot of older people, I have grandfathers coming up to me all the time, and they're finding out that they're on the spectrum when the grandkid is diagnosed. And granddad had a job all his life because he had a paper route at age 11, and he'd been working the whole time he was in high school.
And I think Joanne would absolutely agree. And so I want to move on to another question here. They want to know, what's the best advice for caregivers who have newly diagnosed toddlers in regards to helping with relating and educating their children?
Well, we've got to make sure we start doing some early intervention. And when I was 2 years old and a toddler, my speech teacher did a lot of work on learning how to wait and take turns. Do not wait 2 years for diagnosis. You've already got a diagnosis. He's not talking, and his behavior's not very social and has problems. Teach these kids how to take turns, playing little turn-taking games, board games, maybe with a ball, throwing it back and forth. My speech teacher would speak very slowly to me, start teaching me words, but you've got to start working with this kid now. And the book I'd recommend, my books for that, is The Way I See It. And I'd recommend getting the book now, and you start working on this kid now. If you can get services right away, wonderful. But if you're in a part of the country where services are not available, then you need to get some volunteers from your church group, because the worst thing you can do with a 2-year-old that's not talking is to do nothing. That is the worst. Earlier we work on these kids, the better.
Wonderful. Another person says, Dr. Grandin, any advice for communication and socialization for my 20-year-old autistic son who is verbal but only expresses his needs and wants? And they said, thank you.
Well, the thing about an autistic person is you've got to get out and experience things, because you learn things by comparing it back to previous experience. And when I first did public speaking, I was scared, and I walked out of a class where I was doing public speaking. And you've got to get out and do things. Some of the things that helped me was being party hostess when I was 8, 9 years old. I had to shake hands with the guests. They've got to get them out doing things. And I had friends who shared interests. You know, for me and for you, Anita, it was horses was one of the big things. Also, I had model rockets as one of my shared interests, and electronics lab. Doing friends who shared interests. Because when I was in high school and I was bullied and teased, those were the places that were refuges away from bullying and teasing. And give the kids some choices. Okay, you could do karate, or you could do robotics, or you could do robotics, or you could do band. Give them some choices. But you basically just got to get them out doing things.
I love that. And it kind of feeds into this next question. Ari says, I have Asperger's and I love wolves and wildlife biology. Is this unhealthy? I think that it's okay. I have a healthy lifestyle and I go outside a lot, but people tell me it's not good.
No, wildlife biology? You can have a career in wildlife biology. There's a lot of people that work in wildlife biology. Might be something you might want to major in college. And what I want to emphasize in college today, do internships. They lead to jobs. So if you go into a wildlife biology department, we have one right here on the CSU campus. You need to be doing an internship every summer in wildlife biology. You know, wildlife biology is a career choice that's totally doable.
I agree. Andrew.
And Shannon, I just want to point out,
yes,
everything that you're talking about, the driving, the internship, everything, and jobs, this is all addressed in this book. Also, the stories I tell my friends, and Temple's big message. And there's a chapter in there we talk about the driving and how Temple learned how to drive. So yes, all these things that we're touching on right now are also covered in this book.
I thank you for pointing that out, and I appreciate that. There's one more question. Andrew wants to know, hi, Dr. Grandin. This is Andrew. I've got a question for you. I'm on the spectrum. Do you think having sensory issues counts as outbursts?
Well, sensory issues are a real issue. I mean, I had problems with sound sensitivity, and one of the ways to help reduce sound sensitivity is you have control over it. Like there was one boy who was afraid of the vacuum cleaner, and when they let him play with it where you could turn it on and off and control it, he finally got to where he could tolerate it better. There's a paper you might want to get. It's called Environmental Enrichment is an Effective Treatment for Autism. You need to type these 3 words into Google. Autism, environmental enrichment. And what you do in this paper is you stimulate 2 different senses at the same time, and you constantly vary the 2 senses that you stimulate. Now, I want to tell you an interesting thing on sensory about astronauts. There was the astronaut that spent a year on the space station, and when he got back, he had sensory sensitivity of his skin, with his clothes rubbing on his skin, really similar to someone with autism. Now, he didn't say autism, but what he described in an interview, he said it was a burning sensation. You see, and that's because his skin had no input, like his clothes didn't hardly touch him when he was in weightlessness of space. And it went away after a couple of months when he got back home. When he got back home, he jumped into the pool with his clothes on. He had sensory issues, but they were caused by a lack of tactile sensory input while he was in the space station in weightlessness.
It's fascinating.
I think sensory issues for me is the number one top thing that needs to be researched in autism. Big number one area that needs to be researched: treatments for sensory problems. They range from being a nuisance to being very debilitating.
Well, and Anita, you can chime in and talk about sensory issues too, because you have sensory issues.
Yes.
And it's part of what has led to you being discriminated against in your job. Don't you agree?
Yes, of course, the loud heavy metal music, yes, being played in the operating room. Yes.
But you are completely able to do your job at the top of your game, and if people were just respectful, these sensory issues wouldn't prevent you from doing your job.
Right, I mean, it doesn't prevent me from doing my job, it just physically makes me ill, so by the time I leave at the end of the day, I have a raging headache and feel sick all over and totally exhausted, because that kind of massive sensory overload for 12 hours just really wears a person down.
Absolutely.
But I still do my job, but I'm the one who has to suffer for that.
And it's very tiring.
Exactly.
You see, I still have problems with, if I'm in a noisy restaurant, I can tolerate it, but the problem is I'm basically functionally deaf. I can't screen out the restaurant background noise. If I want to have serious conversations with people in the restaurant, I'd prefer a quieter one.
Absolutely. We had one more comment from Maya, who says, Dr. Grandin, this is Maya, who emailed you the other day about Stephen Hawking. And she goes on to say it looks like that she won't be able to see you in Athens, but she's wanting to know if you have anything planned in Atlanta anytime soon.
Well, I have to look at the schedule. I think I got the pleasure of going to Atlanta, but I have to look at the schedule. As of remembering right now, in the close future, I don't remember anything in Atlanta coming up right away.
Had you ever had the opportunity to meet Stephen Hawking?
No, I never met Stephen Hawking. After he died, I looked up a whole lot of things about him, and there were some very interesting things that Stephen Hawking said. One of the things he said is, since he couldn't move, this was in The Economist really recently, couldn't move and couldn't write, he had to use geometry to do all his mathematics in 10. I thought was really interesting, and he used Penrose mathematics. I actually looked some of it up online, and it's pure pattern thinking.
Fascinating gentleman. And Maya further went on to say, Temple, I'm discovering a childhood obsession, which is from Roger Rabbit, the movie, and I want to start a collection. And she says, what are some other ways to work with this obsession? Because she's thinking of starting a collection, but what's another way she could work with that obsession?
Well, if you're good at drawing, you could go into animation. Is one of the things that you could do. It kind of depends. If you wanted to teach, you could teach filmmaking to kids, teach kids animation. Now, when I was a young kid, all I wanted to draw was horse heads. And my mother always encouraged me to draw lots of different things. Take that obsession and broaden it out. Learn about how the Roger Rabbit movies were made. That was one of the very first movies where you had animation and live people action together in the same scene. That was something that was a very new thing when that movie came out.
Yeah, it was fascinating. I know that we need to let you go. We've reached the time that, because you've got a lot of things going on at school today. And but I want to thank you, Temple, for all that you do. I want to thank you for taking the time today and for all those hours with Anita. We're going to keep Anita with us as we move to the next segment. But I want to encourage people to get the book. The book is fabulous. It's Dr. Temple Grandin, the stories.
I can stay a few more minutes.
Oh, okay.
Unless you want to just go on to the next segment.
Well,
I need to leave at at quarter to the hour to get to my class.
Well, we'll keep you as long as we can keep you, Temple.
I stay on a little bit longer, but I do need to leave
to the global.
at quarter to 1 my time to walk over to the 1 o'clock
Okay.
class.
Joanne has something that she wants to pose.
I thought it would
Okay.
be interesting, Temple, to speak to the mission for the UN today for autism awareness is women and children. And as we know globally, that doesn't look the same as it looks here. Women are discriminated against educationally, employment-wise, and also there's more violence with women with autism globally. And you travel globally as well. Would you like to speak to that?
Well, I believe that's somebody else to speak about. I'm not doing any global traveling right now.
Okay.
Well, I've got some cattle stuff I'm working on.
But obviously, these are important issues.
No, they're important issues, and
Yeah.
they're absolutely important issues. But the problem is, I can only work on so many issues.
Absolutely,
And
absolutely.
the other thing is, I am a professor of animal science at Colorado State in the animal science department, and I think it's also important that I still continue to do my actual real career.
Yes.
Autism is a very important part of my life, but it's not my only life. And I had another big thing I thought about when I went to Cape Kennedy. I had a chance to visit the Mars launch platform, and there were some people working on that had Tourette's. And as I walked under the American flag saying, where it said the future starts here, I thought, what would you rather be, Mr. Tourette's or Mr. Mars launch platform? I think I'd rather be Mr. Launchpad. And autism is an extremely important part of who I am. But my career is one of my main identities. And in reading some materials about Stephen Hawking last night, he talked about the importance of career. Now, he was also very active as an activist, especially later in his life.
Absolutely.
But career was what gave Stephen Hawking's life meaning.
Yeah, we're losing you a little bit, but I noticed that one of the things that you talked about in the book that you feel really good about is that when you started out in your career, you were one woman with all those other men, but that you have actually helped other women have a career in the same field. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, somebody has to be the pioneer, and being a woman was a much bigger issue for me than the autism was, the being a woman. And one of the things is I was rather kind of forceful, and I would sort of push my way into things. There's a scene in the HBO movie where I walk up to the editor of the Farmer Ranchman magazine and I get his card. That scene actually happened. Yeah. And I recognized that if I could start writing articles for the Farm magazine, that would open up a lot of doors. I had to have the guts to walk up and get that card, and the movie showed it really well.
And I think that's one of the things that you and Anita have in common is that both of you are, it seems to me, neither one of you will take no for an answer. Anita, do you want to speak to?
Anita, you were going to drive that Zamboni no matter what. And you ended up getting to run the searchlights and drive the Zamboni.
That's right.
I can relate to that.
Yes, exactly.
And these are just some of the things, you guys, that they talk about in the book. I love picturing you driving a Zamboni, Anita, and I agree with Dr. Grandin. There's no way that was not going to happen. But you both have had to push and push and push, and hear the word no, and then find another way in.
Well, one of the things that motivated me to, I've written one column for the Farmer Ranchman, basically on my master's thesis that I did on squeeze chutes. And then after I got kicked out of the Scottsdale feed yard, and they actually did put bull testicles on my vehicle, I then went back to the Farmer Ranchman and suggested that I write a column. So that was my revenge for getting thrown out of Scottsdale feed yard, was to write for the magazine and get a press pass. And I recognized the value of that press pass because it got me into meetings with very expensive registration fees for free.
And where do you think the both of you learned this kind of tenacity? Did you get it from the other women in your lives?
Well, my mother was a bit of a rebel, and she had a lot of tenacity. My grandfather was the co-inventor of the autopilot for airplanes. We used to talk about science all the time, and the other thing that helped me was being that party hostess when I was really little. I learned how to walk up to strange people and just shake hands with them and talk to them.
I love it. Anita, where do you think you got your tenacity?
It's just something that kind of evolved along the way. Being that I came from a poor family, and everything that I wanted to do, I had to really just work really hard and fight for it. And just, I wasn't about to take no for an answer for anything, and just would forge ahead. And if I couldn't get in one way, I just figured out another way. Just like Temple with that, find your way in the back door. That's how it had to work for me. And like, you know, that's the only way. If you want to really do something, you just have to keep on going.
Yeah.
You see, my revenge for getting kicked out of Scottsdale Feed Yard was to become a columnist. And then I remember when I went to cover my first Arizona cattle feeders meeting, they wanted to throw me out. And then I proved to them that when I covered the Arizona cattle feeders meeting, I did it accurately. And I didn't misquote anybody. And I got a reputation as a very good reporter who always quoted everybody accurately. And then people began to respect that. Then the other thing I did to sell jobs is I pull my drawings out and show them to people. And they look at my drawings and go, oh, you may be weird, you drew that? I'd show them pictures of jobs I had designed. Again, selling my work rather than selling myself. I'd go in to interview a client, I just laid the drawings out on the table.
Well, and you talk in the book about how the difference between a man and a woman going for a job. And that a man can be at 60%. What percent does a woman have to be at to do the same job?
Some of it came out of Carol Sandburg's lead in. A lot of women are too chicken to take a job unless they're at the 90%. Most guys will take a job at the 60%. When I took that dip vat job, I was at the 60% level. And I said, give me 3 weeks, because this is pre-internet. So I had to get drawings on how to do these concrete reinforcement stuff. And I got on the phone the next day and I got the drawings. I went all over Arizona looking at different dip vats. But I've also seen a guy, when working professionally, who was at the 20% level, and he had such a big ego that he didn't bother to learn, and he wrecked a meatpacking plant. Wrecked it. It had to close. I was actually on that project. I was just horrified.
And he got to keep his job, is that correct?
Well, he actually ended up eventually switching to another very good job after he basically didn't put enough wastewater treatment into a meatpacking plant, and they were told by all the other engineers that he didn't have enough wastewater treatment. He went ahead with it anyway, and the city shut him down.
Yeah, and if a woman had done that, I think the outcome might have been different.
A woman's career.
Yes.
If a woman had done that. I mean, I watched another plant. I was on another project where a guy wrecked a refrigeration system because he didn't listen to anybody.
Wow. Well,
and this was just, I call them the plant wreckers. You know, it's just pure ego. Now, I was at the 60% level, but I scrambled and very quickly got myself up to the 90% level. I went to every dip vat in Arizona, and I got the drawings that show how to do the concrete reinforcement, because I knew somebody in Washington, D.C. to call that worked for the USDA, and he sent me a book that had the drawings. And I got a hold of other places to get other information. That's why I said, give me 3 weeks, because I knew I had to get information together to do that project.
Well, it's always fascinating to hear the tales that you tell, which is one of the reasons why people should get this book, because you're going to hear things that you've never heard anyplace else. And it's just delightful. And not only that, you'll get to know Anita Lesko. So we want to encourage people. You can get it on Amazon. You can get it in all the major booksellers, and you can get it at Future Horizons. They have a great website where you can get all of Temple's books there. We want to thank Future Horizons for all that they do. Temple, I know you got to get over to your class, and we got to get on to our next segment, but it is always a pleasure to have you with us.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and I'm going to run off to class, and I hope I didn't fade in and out too much.
Not too much. Not too much at all.
Welcome to Autism Live. We have a very special guest on the phone this morning, as promised. We have Temple Grandin on the phone with us. First of all, Temple, good morning.
Good morning. How are you doing?
I'm good. I understand that you had a great deal of snow this morning.
Oh, we had a horrible amount of snow last night. I gave a talk over in Greeley at the educational college, and the roads were just horrible coming back home.
Wow. It's not supposed to happen at this time of the month in April, is it? In the beginning of April, maybe, but craziness. Well, Temple, we have so many questions for you. It's kind of overwhelming. We put out a call to parents asking if there was anything that they wanted to ask you and individuals who are on the spectrum. And we have so many questions. There's no way that we're going to get through all of them, but I want to get to as many as possible. So if it's okay with you.
Why don't you try to pick out the questions where people may have had the same question, from several different people.
And I've tried to do that in a couple of different things. Starting with the first question is, what was the most difficult thing that you've had to overcome during your teenage years, and how did you overcome it?
Oh, teasing and bullying was absolutely the worst. And the only place where I was not teased and bullied was when I was horseback riding or doing Model Rocket Club or doing electronics lab. Those specialized interests were refuges away from teasing. Now, one of the problems we have today is today, if I had been out riding, they would have been texting me all kinds of horrible stuff like tape recorder and workhorse. Those were some of the names that they called me. Teasing was the worst possible thing. I can't emphasize enough the importance of getting these kids involved with shared interests, like electronics, school play, band, because those can be refuges from teasing.
Okay, absolutely wonderful question. This is a great question that came in from a viewer. What do autistic people pay attention to when they are communicating with other people?
Well, when I was young, I didn't even know about all the little subtle eye signals. I didn't even know they existed until I read about them in a book when I was 50 years old. And, that's sort of like not knowing the language. Now, today, there's so many educational materials that can teach people those things.
Absolutely. But for younger kids, when you were younger and you didn't know about those things, what kinds of things did you pay attention to?
Well, I knew if somebody was laughing out loud or if somebody was mad. I certainly understood that. It was the subtle things that I did not understand.
Yeah. Interesting. Was there something, though, were you somebody who looked at people's faces, or did you just listen to the tone of their voice before you knew about those subtle things?
Well, the only subtle sign that I picked up was tone of voice.
Okay. And
when I was getting my business started, I would sometimes call up clients, and if they had a little whine in their voice, then I knew that maybe they weren't happy with me. And that's a subtle signal that animals pick up. If you went up to your dog and you went, "You're a horrible dog," and you said it like that, he'd wag his tail.
Yes.
Because he's going to be cueing into the tone of voice.
Right. Very fascinating. Okay, so tone of voice then is probably really important, especially when you're working with younger kids.
Yes.
Okay, interesting. All right, a little bit more specific question here. My 5-year-old is high-functioning autistic. When he gets agitated, for example, his sister takes his toy, he thumps himself in his head and his face. What can I do to make him use his words? And they wrote, P.S., your life story was an awakening for me. I understood my boy so much more, so thank you.
Well, that's really good. I'm glad that they understood him better. One of the things we've got to do is teach kids about turn taking, because I was reading some research where some of the executive function problems can be improved with the kid has to learn how to inhibit a response. And I was taught turn taking with the Parcheesi board. Also, I had to learn that you've got to give those dice a fair shake. And I was always encouraged to speak. But I think working on activities where he has to inhibit a response will help on this.
Absolutely. I think
board games are absolutely great.
I'm a fan of board games, too. We taught my son so many different life skills using board games, and it was very reinforcing.
They really helped me.
Well, and Parcheesi was your favorite one?
Well, you see, right after the war, when I was 2.5 years old, the children's board games just did not exist.
Oh.
And so the checkers was too hard, and so my mother got the 2 easiest grown-up games, and they were Parcheesi and Chinese checkers that you play with the marbles.
Right.
And the Parcheesi board was the main board game that was used with me when I was very, very young.
Wow. Do you still play board games, Temple?
No, I don't now, but I really recommend them for little kids. The other thing is, back in the 50s, things that were really fun you had to do with other kids. Because when I was a little older, I got a table hockey set, and that was my favorite thing. But you have to play that with somebody else.
Yeah. That's a really good point, because a lot of games now, kids get to isolate with computer games and things and be by themselves. Even if they're chatting with somebody else, they're very isolated while they're doing it.
Well, I think we've got to be doing more activities involving turn-taking and playing with other kids in the real world. Now, something like a Wii. Okay, if you do tennis doubles on the Wii,
yes,
yeah, that is doing something. So I'm not anti-technology.
Right.
So let's do things where the kids have to interact in real life. It could be with an electronic game. You can get electronic Scrabble now. You can play that, with two kids playing it on a phone.
Yes.
But I want the kids interacting in the real world together. They have got to learn those social skills.
Absolutely.
And if you use an electronic device, fine. But I want them taking turns with that thing that's on the phone.
Okay, great. Interesting that you brought up technology, because our next question was about getting equipment and technology and finding funding for it. And they wanted to know if you're aware of any grants or insurance that would help to cover that. We're looking for an iPad, since it has apps that can help with speech issues and task management.
Well, one of the things now is old iPads can probably be bought very, very cheaply on eBay. The iPad 1 is going to work just fine. Now, I know the Go is kind of pricey, but I think if you look around, you can find other apps that are free.
Yes.
Also, for older kids and high-functioning kids, there's fabulous free college courses online.
Yes.
Things like Coursera, TEDx, and Udacity, and Khan Academy.
Absolutely. You gave me some great advice about that for my son. We actually wrote a blog about it on our site, listing all those things that you had told me for my son. If people are interested, they can go to our blog to find that.
How many hits did you get on that stuff?
You know what? That's a really good question, and I'll have to look that up for you, because I don't know off the top of my head. But I will find that out and let you know, Temple, because it was really good information. Yes, because it's...
Okay, let's do some more questions.
Yes, absolutely. We had a lot of questions about sensory issues. One in particular, my 9-year-old has a lot of sensory issues that cause her to flap her hands and jump up and down when she's excited. Is there a way we can help her to control these overstimulations?
Well, I think working with an OT, there's a number of different sensory activities that can help reduce this, things like deep pressure, slow swinging. Another thing that helps is just heavy work. I think one of the reasons why I liked cleaning the horse stalls so much when I was 15 is that the heavy work helped to calm down my nerves.
Interesting.
And lots of exercise also helps. Other things, fish oil supplements. I've been taking some B6 and magnesium that I just buy over at Whole Foods, and that's been helpful for me. I get the Blue Bonnet B100s. Let's get 10 tons of sugar out of the diet.
Yeah.
And I found myself, I've got to have some animal protein in the morning, otherwise I just cannot function.
Interesting.
But work with a good OT that's trained in sensory activities. Also, what was done with me, I was allowed to have an hour after lunch where I could just veg out and spin things. But then there were other places where it was not allowed, like the dinner table or in the classroom. But some of these kids need to have sensory breaks where they can do a calming activity. And one of the reasons some kids do these behaviors is that they are calming.
Yeah.
But the problem, you let the kid do it all day, his mind's not going to develop.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think that's super duper advice. You had talked the last time we talked with you about limiting the amount of time that they could stim, and we've had several parents write in and said they've said how effective that has been working with their kids.
Good.
Very good, good advice.
We limit it. We don't eliminate it. We limit it.
Absolutely. Super advice. Somebody wants to know, what are your thoughts on yellow street signs similar to those for deaf or blind people for neighborhoods with autistic children? I'm battling with my city trying to get one. They say they're only available for people with physical disabilities or sensory issues. I say to them that autism can be both, but they won't listen.
What kind of signs they're trying to get? I don't understand.
They want to put up like a yellow sign like you would put up for a deaf child or for a blind child, notifying people in the neighborhood that they need to use caution and slow down. And she wants to know what you think about that to label. We had one in our neighborhood that said deaf child area so that people were just a little bit more aware. She's wanting to put up one that says autistic child, and she wants to know what your thoughts are on that.
Well, you could just get your own sign and put it up.
That's true. That's true. But do you think there's anything negative in terms of doing that and notifying people in the neighborhood?
One of the problems is I think drivers might get confused because they're going to know what a deaf child is.
Yeah.
But, you're not sure what an autistic child's going to do. See, sometimes they get so much in their own world that they act like they're deaf.
Yeah.
They're not aware of what's going on around them.
And so maybe if the concern is that the child elopes, maybe they need to put up a deaf child sign. I think what she's concerned about is safety.
Just put up a sign, something. I know that a lot of people don't like the word handicapped, but I'm looking at drivers.
Yes.
Going down a street.
For them to understand.
I think they're going to react better to a sign that said handicapped child caution than autistic child, because they're not going to know how to react to that. Because you don't know who's driving down that street.
Great. And speaking of driving, our next question is about driving. What challenges did you face when you first learned to drive? My son is 16, has Asperger's, and doesn't want to drive, but will if pushed to. He's a very good driver with a few exceptions that make me too nervous to let him go out on the road alone. Just wondering how you felt and how you handled this experience.
Well, I spent a year on easy roads before I did any freeways or did any traffic.
Okay.
You've got to get the driving, in other words, braking, steering, and gas, so practiced that it becomes like autopilot, where you don't have to think about that. And then ease into, more difficult traffic. And that deals with the multitasking problem. He needs to just get hours and hours and hours behind the wheel, parking, driving in totally safe places, like a big supermarket parking lot, the little road in a suburban cul-de-sac. Practice, practice, practice. Because what was done with me was out on my aunt's ranch. The mailbox was 3 miles away, and 6 days a week, I drove the car up to the mailbox on a dirt road. Actually, it was a pickup truck with 3 on the column with a really awful balky clutch. So that was 6 miles of driving I did a day with my aunt sitting right beside me for an entire summer. And that's a lot of practice. He's got to just get in the hours of practice.
Okay.
And then you go on an easy suburban street where you got to do a few lights, there's just a few other cars, and you gradually work into more difficult situations.
Okay. Were you excited to get behind the wheel, though, or were you a little bit reluctant in the beginning?
I was reluctant. My aunt just said to me, we're going to start to learn how to drive.
Okay.
And the very first day, she didn't make me deal with the clutch. And so I sat beside her, and I steered the truck.
Okay.
And as soon as I got used to steering, then she got me in the truck, and I had to deal with the clutch, and the truck lurched forward. But we were in a dirt driveway where there was nothing to hit.
Okay.
And I had to learn how to work that clutch. But I was doing this all out on dirt roads where there was just hardly any other cars around.
Right. Right. Fascinating. Okay. Good. Good to know. Next question is about a 10-year-old who protests for every single task, wants to really do nothing. What strategy do you suggest, Temple?
When you say wants to do nothing, what are some of the tasks he's being asked to do?
Well, and she doesn't go into any further detail on that, but we do have a couple of other questions that have to do with this too, of children who just really want to sit and veg, that they're, being asked to get dressed, asked to go to school, asked to go outside and play, asked to engage in activity, and it's not even that they're wanting to play video games, they just want to veg. And
some of this is really, really high anxiety.
Okay.
Because I can remember one time getting into big panic attacks and wanting to just stay in my room and not do anything. My mother would just come and get me out.
Okay.
There was one thing, they weren't going to let me be a recluse in my room.
Yeah.
Just wasn't going to be allowed. And when I was at the boarding school and I was not doing very much studying, I was doing a lot of horse stall cleaning. But the place where they drew a line in the sand is I was not allowed to just stay in my room. I had to show up at meals. I had to show up at chapel. I had to go to movie night. And I didn't want to do movie night because I was nervous, so they made me projectionist.
Oh, great idea. That's wonderful. And so, Temple, what were there consequences if you didn't do it, or were there incentives for doing it?
Well, if I had just was going to totally stay in my room and not get dressed for church, there would have been consequences.
Okay.
And always rather severe ones.
And what did they offer you the incentive that you could do the spinning with the plate on your bed if you did do it?
No, they didn't do anything like that.
Okay.
I don't know if you got to remember. I just never got to that point because there were expectations.
Okay.
That I had to come down to meals.
Yes.
And I can remember twice in my life getting spanked, and there was always that threat.
Okay.
And I also would get television taken away from me.
Okay.
And I wanted to watch the Howdy Doody show. And if I threw tantrums and things like that, there'd be no Howdy Doody show for one night.
Okay. Well, that's a pretty big consequence. All right. Somebody wants to know, what did you need from school that you did not get?
Well, actually, I had a good elementary school education. Where I got into problems at school was in high school. I just wasn't interested in teenage girls. They're no longer interested in doing projects, and I still wanted to do projects. High school, in a large girls' school, was a disaster. I got thrown out for fighting because kids teased me. And that was some of the worst parts of my life. We need to develop the areas of strength. Like my ability in art was always encouraged, and that became the basis of my career.
Well, that's a wonderful thing. Lovely compliments that people sent you. Somebody said, Temple, hello, you are an inspiration, intelligent, and caring woman. Thank you for your contributions to the world of autism. I have to ask you about the movie part with your mother. You and your mother are on the stairs. She has flashcards. She is slowly pronouncing C-A-T, cat, cat.
Og. Da. Og. Temple. Dog. Temple. Cat. At. Cat. Temple. Trough. Mom. Me.
Exactly what my speech teacher did.
Okay.
She slowed down and she enunciated the words. And I can remember her holding up a cup. She tended to use objects more than flashcards. And she'd hold up a cup and she'd say, now say cup, cup, pa. And she'd slow down and enunciate the hard consonant sounds so I could hear them.
Yeah.
Because when the grown-ups talked really fast, it sounded like gibberish. In fact, I thought grown-ups had their own special language.
Interesting. We've heard many autistic adults saying that when the words came in, they sounded like something completely different, and they seemed to go fast. So that's very interesting. And she wanted to know if you think that type of work with a toddler is important if they're on the autism spectrum.
You mean would work with flashcards or work
going that slow, one-on-one, and going that slow, that skill building.
I think autistic toddlers need lots and lots of one-on-one, and that's supported by all the research on applied behavior analysis, or ABA. These kids need 20 or 30 hours a week of one-on-one teaching with an effective teacher that just kind of knows how hard to push the child. You push them too hard, they have a meltdown. You don't push them enough, they don't advance. But some kids you have to slow down a whole lot, maybe others you do not. That's going to be very, very variable.
Okay.
My speech teacher would say, now say cup, and then she'd go, cup, pa. Okay, say cup. Okay, now cup, pa. She'd go back and forth between saying it regular and saying it very, very slowly.
Okay, good advice. All right, so we had a lot of questions about difficulties with getting kids to do homework, and I picked one in particular. She writes, my autistic daughter is 9 years old and has meltdowns when it comes to doing homework, especially when it comes to putting pencil to paper, knowing she knows it in her head. At times she can rattle off the answers orally, and other times when it's the easiest of answers like 2 + 2 = 4, she says it's too hard. She cannot focus on the task. I give her little breaks and don't pressure her, but a sheet of homework can last for hours, and a lot of screaming, stomping, crying, biting, punching, throwing things, etc. in between. How do I make this a much simpler task for both of us? She's been getting ABA therapy from school, but they're not seeing a difference with what's happening at school.
Well, first of all, I've got to try to figure out what's going on here, whether there's some kind of sensory problem with the writing instrument. See, this is the kind of thing where I've got to get a lot more information about why she's throwing these fits. I've got to make sure that maybe she has a problem with fluorescent lights, in the place where she has to do the homework. because this is sounding, it's so severe.
Yeah.
It's sounding like a sensory issue. My problem with doing homework is I just was not interested. It was not a sensory reason. And I only knuckled down and started studying in high school when I had the goal of becoming a scientist. See, that's a different thing. And maybe a child that's got some kind of sensory issue doesn't like touching the paper or something. You know, maybe we should do her homework on a computer. You know, I don't know. I'd have to ask a lot more questions.
So, but the potential to change the variables up, because it also strikes me that she mentions that she can, a lot of the times she can do the question in her head, but when it comes to the easiest of answers, that she says it's too hard. And I know it's, you just were mentioning that sometimes it wasn't interesting to you, it was boring.
Well, that's one thing, but the other thing is you can have a kid that's echolele. In other words, they yak out all these TV commercials, but they don't know what they mean.
Yeah.
You see, what might be happening, and I'm just saying, I want to emphasize, might be happening.
Right.
Is that the circuit in the brain for doing this with auditory is working, but maybe her vision, maybe she's got visual processing problems. And she's seeing kind of broken up stuff, and she doesn't see the paper right. And in my book, The Way I See It, I've got 2 chapters in there where I address visual processing problems. Yeah. Maybe the print jiggling on the page, and so in other words, she might be an auditory learner, and maybe that's the way we need to approach things.
Okay, interesting. So lots of different variables. And you mentioned your book. You've got a new book that's coming out. Do you want to tell us really quickly what the new book is?
Well, the new book is going to be called The Autistic Brain. It's going to be released on April 30th. And I worked with a really great co-author, Richard Panik, a super, super science writer. The first chapter reviews the history of the diagnostic criteria.
Lovely.
And I have to say it was rather shocking seeing the whole history just laid out side by side, see how much they changed the diagnosis. Then the next chapter, we go into genetics research, and it's complicated genetics research. We have a whole chapter in sensory in there. I think a lot of people are going to find helpful. I have a chapter on the different kinds of minds, visual thinking mind, the mathematics mind, word minds, and then a chapter on all my brain scans that have been done on me, and there's the pictures of all the brain scans, and then a final chapter on jobs for the different kinds of minds and getting people prepared for careers.
Lovely. Well, I can't wait to read this. And we actually have a bunch of questions about jobs that I'm going to get to before we get done. Really interesting question that caught my attention, wondering what you think about it. Somebody wrote in and said, my daughter talks to her hands as if they were puppets. She refers to her left hand as the bad hand and her right hand as the good hand. She sometimes puts things in between her fingers of her left hand as if they were eating something or putting things on top of it as a hat. She has different voices for each of them. She calls the left hand Jessie, named for a classmate of hers, and the right hand her name. Sometimes the hands smack each other. Could this be something that is going on at school that she's having a hard time telling us? My daughter does talk, but she has a hard time expressing how she is feeling and gets frustrated when I ask.
Well, she may be just trying to act out with her hands.
Yeah.
Literally just using them as puppets. And I don't know how old this child is or what exactly the level of functioning is. But one of the things I've observed in autism is you can have, like in my own case, for example, my visual thinking works really well, but my algebra department is broken. There's a tendency to be uneven skills. And she may be, talking, maybe things aren't hooked up all that well, but she's just trying to act it out with her hands because that's how she's trying to communicate.
Absolutely. We had a lot of questions from parents whose children don't speak and wanting your help. One in particular, my son is 10 and is totally nonverbal but very bright. He's the only student in his class that sight reads and he spells quite well, no tantrums, very affectionate, great eye contact, and very gentle but totally nonverbal. His developmental neurologist says he has a great constitution and could start talking soon. Is there anything I can do to help him start speaking? He does flap his hands and lines up his toys, but otherwise seems to be really far ahead of his other classmates.
Well, what I'm wondering is maybe he needs to just start typing.
Yeah.
Like give him a laptop or even better yet, give him an iPad. And the reason why that works better is because when you type on the virtual keyboard, the print appears right next to the keyboard. Because some individuals that are nonverbal can't attention shift from print appearing on the top of the laptop screen and then have to look down at the keyboard. And that's why sometimes laptops don't work.
Okay.
iPads do, I would just introduce this kid to typing.
Okay.
Because I think he might become totally fluent typing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's great advice.
I would definitely try that, and I would probably start with an iPad, because that solves the attention shifting problem.
Love that. So many people wanted to know about telling their child that they have autism, and when you knew that you were autistic, and if you have suggestions about how and when to tell someone that they're on the spectrum.
Well, if a kid can read, I mean, I have the book, Cy Montgomery book, Temple Grandin by Cy Montgomery, which is a really nice little book.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a number of children's books out. There's Little Rain Man by Karen Simmons. But the thing I'm seeing is I'm seeing too many kids on the high end of the spectrum getting hung up on their autism.
Mm-hmm.
All they want to talk about is their autism rather than about their science project, or they like, rocket ships, or they like dogs, or they like to do their math homework. I'd rather see them get hung up on something else.
Yeah.
Autism is an important part of who I am, but my other activities is my primary identity. And now for older individuals, when they're having dating problems and marital relations problems, this is where diagnosis is really helpful.
Yeah.
And I discussed this in my book, Different Not Less, where 14 people on the spectrum get diagnosed in 50s and 60s, and that diagnosis really helped with their relationships.
Yeah.
And all the people in that book had jobs all their life. But I'm seeing too many smart kids getting so hung up on autism that they're not learning how to work. And I think this is a really serious problem.
Yeah.
And when I was 13 years old, I had a mother arranged a little job for me, selling clothes for seamstress. When I was 15, I was cleaning horse stalls. When I was 16, I was doing carpentry work, shingling the barn roof. Painting signs for our school events. Mm-hmm. I had lots of work experience.
Absolutely. How old were you when you first knew the word autism?
Probably end of elementary school.
Okay. And was it your mom who talked to you about it?
Yes.
And how did she explain it to you, Temple?
Well, you see, this is the thing. You got to remember the era that I live in.
Yeah.
And there was no autism materials. There's no books or nothing that she could explain to me. Just explained that my brain was kind of different. And none of the materials that are available now were available. There were no support groups.
Yeah, but in a way, we all look at you and you've done so well, and clearly she explained it to you so that it was something that was different. And of course, we know that it was important for your mom to know that you were different but equal, not less. Different but not less, as you've said.
The other thing that was done with me is things I was good at was encouraged, but I wasn't praised for every little tiny thing that I did. When I was around 3rd or 4th grade, I made a beautiful clay horse, and that was praised.
Yeah.
And when I did a very nice watercolor of a beach, that was put in a professional frame and hung on the wall with the professional pictures. But every little piece of art I brought home, crummy little thing I brought home from school, I can remember an ashtray I made in the 1st grade. It was, I know it's politically incorrect now to make ashtrays, but that was a 1st grade project.
Yes.
It's probably not worthy of praise. But when I did something really good, then she really praised it.
Okay. So you knew when you did something well because she saved the praise for that.
She saved the praise for the really good stuff.
Okay. You brought up the whole idea of romance and relationships, and we had a lot of people writing in for advice about that. One mom in particular who said, my son is 17 and I would like to know... Oh, no, I'm sorry. That's another one. How can I help my 20-year-old son with autism meet a girl or at least a companion? There is no hurry, of course, as he is anxious and afraid to deal with such an issue. He already works, drives, and manages his bank account, helps pay his bills, etc. There are times that he would like to have someone his own age to go to movies with and or travel with. And we had lots of people who wrote in, Temple, and said, how do we help our teenagers and our young adults to meet people with like interests for the potential for romance?
Well, I think we've got to get involved with the shared interests. I mean, I know a lady named Jennifer Myers, and she's got a very nice book on learning life skills. And Jennifer met her husband at a science fiction convention. That's an example of shared interests.
Yeah.
They're both computer people, or they met each other at a historical reenactment society. Get involved with events where you get these intense shared interests, and that's where you can find a soulmate. Most of my friends are involved with autism, animal behavior, or scientific stuff.
And so you have your core group of friends shared interests.
That's right. So get your son involved with. First thing I'd ask that mom is, what's your son interested in?
Yeah.
What's your son doing at work? Does he really like his work? Obviously, if his work was janitor work, I don't think you want to have shared interest in that. But let's say he worked for a computer company, or he worked for something else, something a bit more interesting. There might be a shared interest there.
Okay.
But that's where things are going to be the best. It could be an art group. It could be a drama group. It could be a choir, a church choir. It could be all. So then maybe you do other singing things together.
Okay, great. And would you say that because we also had people with younger kids writing in saying, how do I work on friendships without the romance? So would the same thing apply to the younger kids as well? Okay.
Same thing. Shared interests. And the other thing we've got to work on is the turn taking.
Yeah.
And the kid not totally monopolizing the conversation. Like there's kind of a good rule where, I got fixated on things like carnival rides. Well, okay, I only tell that story twice, because I go on and on about that and just drive people completely crazy. It's the same thing, shared interests.
Okay, wonderful. Somebody wrote in, you were talking about algebra just a second ago. They were wanting to know, they had heard you talking and saying that there was one type of math that was particularly difficult, if not impossible, for people with autism. Other people wrote in and said that wasn't quite exactly right, that you mentioned that you're not good with algebra, but they want to know, would that be true of all people with autism? And it seems like a lot of our viewers were concerned about math problems that are considered word problems, that their children are having difficulty with
word
those.
Problems. I have a problem with word problems because you've got to sequence information, and I just don't get a lot of the word problems. But when it comes to things like algebra, it was horrible for me as a visual thinker. But there's other kids on the autism spectrum, they do algebra just fine.
Yeah.
So it's very variable.
Okay.
The pattern I tend to see, and I have a whole chapter on this in the Autistic Brain book, is I'm a photorealistic visual thinker. I can visualize things photorealistically in my head. I have trouble with algebra. Then you have another kind of kid. He's a math genius. He's good at everything in math, but may have trouble with reading. And then you've got a kid that's a word kid, and he'll know everything about his favorite movies or about, cars or whatever his interest is. Math skills, just average, not a visual thinker. And then you've got others that are an auditory learner, and they learn everything through their ears, and they are not a visual thinker, and often they have visual processing problems.
So key is figuring out which one of those areas your child fits into, which will help you to know how to address issues.
Well, and the thing is, you can get mixtures of these things, too. But those are definitely, you can get mixtures.
Okay.
But it's very, very variable. But there is a tendency to be good at one thing and bad at something else. That seems to be kind of universal, the uneven skills when you get on the higher end of the spectrum.
Okay, awesome. We had a lot of questions about your mom, your awesome mom. Somebody in particular wanted to know, what do you think your mother would say is the single most important thing she focused on when raising you?
Well, she just focused on, she had a good sense of stretching me. She just knew how hard she could push. Push too hard to get a tantrum, but she was always stretching me just a little bit outside my comfort zone. I'm seeing too many kids that are kind of coddled too much, and they aren't learning how to shop and things like that. Now, obviously, no surprises. Surprises cause panic. You absolutely cannot have sudden surprises.
Okay.
But she kind of just knew just how to kind of stretch me and get me to develop.
Okay, awesome. What an awesome lady your mom is. Somebody else wants to know, do you have strategies that you have found successful in working through emotional highs and emotional lows?
Well, a lot of that's been controlled now with antidepressant medication. When I got it to be a teenager, I had a horrible time with constant panic attacks and anxiety, and that is controlled with antidepressant medication.
Okay.
And, I have a lot of information on medication in the Way I See It book and Thinking in Pictures. Oh, there's way too many medications given out to little kids like candy. But for me, a low dose of an antidepressant stops the anxiety.
Okay.
And you've got to use very, very low doses, because if you use too high a dose, you're going to get agitation and insomnia. I've had probably 100 parents say to me, oh, he did just wonderful on a low dose of Prozac, and we doubled it, and it was just horrible.
Okay.
He should have stayed on the low dose.
And we had a lot of questions that came in about medication, those sorts, and people were wanting to know, how do you feel about prescription medications versus homeopathic medications for anxiety, if you have any preference?
Well, I think we need to get rid of all this fighting between the alternative and regular medication. In very young children, I definitely want to avoid heavy-duty drugs with bad side effects, like the antipsychotics, like Risperdal or Abilify. I want to try to avoid those in young kids. Mm-hmm. Let's do some of the diets first. Yeah. Those help a subset of kids. Dairy-free, wheat-free, maybe try some B vitamins and some magnesium. Fish oil supplements have a good effect on the brain. Not eating a ton of sugar, getting plenty of exercise. Yeah. Let's do some of those things first. But there are some older kids and adults that are going to need some careful, conservative use of medication. And I recommend that you read Thinking in Pictures and my second edition of my Way I See It book. I also have some information on TempleGrandin.com.
Okay, awesome. I love this question. We had a lot of questions about educating other people about how the autistic brain works, and I'm loving that you've got a whole book about this coming out. The question is how you learn to express the manner of your thought process so that others might understand how you think and thereby help you to understand how neurotypical people think. My child struggles daily with making themselves understood in a neurotypical world, and you seem to have gained an understanding, if not an actual knack for it. And I do think, Temple, I have to say that I think there are so many things about you that are wonderful, but one of the greatest gifts I feel as a parent that you do give us that insight, and you've shown us actually visually how your brain works, and it's so eye-opening. How can we help our other kids to be able to show us how their brain works?
Well, first of all, when I was very young, I didn't know that other people didn't think in pictures.
Right.
And one of the mistakes I made when I wrote Thinking in Pictures was just thinking everybody on the autism spectrum thinks in pictures, mm-hmm. which is not true. Mm-hmm. And then I started, reading more and more stuff and learning more and more things and questioning people about how they think. I realized how my thinking was different. And there's going to be a whole chapter in the new book just on this whole, different ways people think. I find this to be a very fascinating subject. Yeah. And I've read other self-reports. I have found that, some of the brain research and some of the self-reports were some of the best things that I read. Now, how can you tell if your little kid what kind of mind he has? It usually doesn't show up until 3rd or 4th grade, 8 or 9 years old. Okay. That is when I did my really good artwork, and my visual thinking showed up as artwork. Things like making a very nice clay horse, for example, and drawing. And you want to encourage the kid to draw lots of other things. If the kid's good at math, that's going to show up, in 3rd or 4th grade. Kid's good at reading, that's going to show up. First of all, what subject is a kid good at? Does a kid like to build with Legos? That's going to be both the visual thinkers and the mathematical thinkers. And then the word kids don't usually care about Legos.
Interesting, very interesting, because I hear my kid in there. That's a wonderful thing. Okay, we have a question about dealing with when a child is perseverating on something, because, and of course I've lost it on the list here, but a parent who wrote in said when their child perseverates on something that it raises their anxiety. And what advice would you give to the parent about dealing with the child's perseveration? Do they stop it or let it be? And then if they're going to let the child continue to perseverate on something, how do they deal with their own anxiety having to do with it?
Well, what was done with my perseveration was allowed to have an hour after lunch where I could spin things. And other times it was not allowed. Yeah. Dinner table, not allowed. So I think it's okay to give a child some times in the day where he can do some of this perseveration stuff. And then you have other times in the day where it's not allowed, like church and school and classroom. I think it's just fine when the kid gets home from school. He could have an hour to decompress and calm down and perseverate, maybe even play a video game for an hour. But then after an hour, then I want to stop it.
And then for the parent who's feeling the anxiety when their child is perseverating, any advice on that, Temple?
Well, I would just tell them that if you limit it, not to worry about it.
Okay.
They do these things to calm down. And I think it's best to allow some scheduled time
where some of this stuff is allowed, and then other times we don't do it, like at the table, for example.
Right. I love this question. I can't wait to hear your answer. Somebody wrote in, with your ability to see details, do you have any ideas or solutions for how Colorado can conserve or channel our water to be of better use for our crops?
Oh boy, I'd have to do a lot of studying on that. I don't have the knowledge to, to answer that one. Now, pictures started to come into my head. I started seeing satellite photographs. I started seeing, when I lived in Arizona, the Salt River dams and things. But there's a lot of stuff I don't know enough about that to say anything.
Okay, but I love getting an insight into how you begin to problem solve. Very fascinating.
Well, the first pictures that came into my head were satellite photos that show rivers.
Fascinating. Fascinating. A lot of people interested in your schooling. One person in particular who wrote in said that they also attended the Hampshire Country School in New Hampshire from 78 to 81. That was the same private school that you attended. They want to know what you
would have been gone by that point.
And they want to know, did you know Miss Adelaide Patey, the director of the school?
Oh, absolutely, I did. Adelaide was there, and then Henry Patey was there. Oh, yes, I knew Adelaide Patey really, really well.
Wonderful. I'm sure they'll be thrilled to hear that. Lots of questions about finding jobs for kids that are on the spectrum and making sure that it's something that keeps their interest, and in particular about what to do earlier to get a child ready with job skills before they reach the age of 20.
I think we need to start with 13-year-olds. This is the age where kids used to get paper routes, and I know the paper routes are gone now. And if you do have a paper route available, if it's a high-functioning kid, give them a paper route. So let's do other activities outside the home. How about walking dogs? And the thing I like about that is you have to do it every single day, rain or shine. Let's figure out jobs in the neighborhood. How about a tour guide at a little local museum? Some museums will take them at age 12. When they're 16, they can volunteer at an animal shelter. They could work at a farmer's market. They could make PowerPoints for business people. They could fix computers for local businesses. These are things that parents need to just set up in the community with little local businesses to get kids doing things. They've got to learn the discipline of work, and I think it needs to start at 13.
Wow.
But I also think it's never too late to start. I mean, you might have a 22-year-old that's been sitting around. We've got to get him out of the house, and he's got to start doing things. I talked to some parents the other day. Dad owned a store, and their son had problems with the cash register, an very old-fashioned cash register. I said, Dad, why don't you buy a scanner? Because there's problems there with multitasking. Let's just buy a scanner.
Yeah.
They're not that expensive now. And then the 22-year-old's going to get his butt out of the house, and he's going to learn how to use the scanner, and that's not going to tax multitasking. Because the problem that you have is long strings of verbal information are not remembered, and multitasking can be a real problem.
Absolutely. Got a question from a friend. She says, I have an autistic friend. He's pretty social, but he can't read and doesn't have a job. His parents have a lot of money, and he doesn't need to worry about working. He has certain obsessions like Bigfoot and movie action figures. For the most part, his obsessions are fully supported. He's been on Bigfoot hunts and spends thousands of dollars on action figures every year. I'm just wondering if you feel that it's okay to be following the same interests he's had as a kid, or do you think he should be guided to try to learn and read into more adult areas of his life and pushed to do more things? He's never been...
I think we have to do with fixations is we need to broaden them out. When I was very young, I drew constant horse heads all the time. Well, you've got to broaden that out. Okay, let's do the horse's stable. Let's draw a picture of a place where a horse might go. In other words, broaden it out. Okay, Bigfoot hunts. Well, let's learn about some of the woods and the habitat where Bigfoot lives. Start an interest in botany, maybe. You see how I'm making an associative link. Also, this kid should have been, learning some work skills. Now, I don't know exactly what his level of functioning is. That's something where I'd have to ask those parents some more questions.
Right.
So I could think of a job that would be appropriate for his level of functioning. But I would definitely try to channel this into something else. And, okay, we can go on a Bigfoot expedition, but then let's learn about some of the plants that are in that forest where you went on that expedition.
Okay, so broaden it out. A lot of questions about schooling and recommendations for schooling. Some about, one in particular, my son has Asperger's and he's continually bored in school. Do you recommend homeschooling?
I don't even know how old this child is.
No, I know, and I don't
either. Know anything about it. You know, I would have to ask more questions. I was one of the teenagers that had to be taken out of a regular school. But if you homeschool a kid, you can't just let them become a recluse in the house.
Right.
They've got to be out. You've got to get lots of activities planned where they're out doing things. And if you're homeschooling, high-functioning teenager, I think we need to get him a job outside the home.
Okay, great. I love this one. Any advice you can give someone teaching an autistic child how to ride a horse?
Oh, some kids do just great on a horse, and they oftentimes are a little bit afraid when they get on, but there's some nonverbal kids that said their first words on a horse because there's something good about the rhythm and balancing. Now, I want to emphasize it's not for everybody.
Yeah.
You know, therapeutic riding is really wonderful for some kids and not appropriate for others. Same thing with service dogs. For some kids, it's absolutely the best thing, but there's other kids that are terrified of dogs because they never know when it's going to bark and hurt their ears.
Right.
So for one child, it's appropriate. For another child, it's not.
Okay. Talking about math, and we talked about algebra a little bit, somebody wrote in and said, my 18-year-old son struggles with algebra too because he can no longer do the math in his head and hates calculators, working on them, but is excellent in chemistry, biology, principles of architecture, and construction. He wants to be a civil engineer. However, I don't know if the math is going to be a struggle and hold him back. Do you have any advice?
Well, I couldn't do algebra, so I basically had to go into the field of industrial design.
Okay.
You know, when you build projects, you have both the industrial design part, the art part, the architecture part, and unfortunately, a lot of universities require algebra. And the only way I got through college was back in '66, the required math class was finite math, which is matrices, probability, and statistics. And I get worried that this algebra requirement is going to block a lot of people. Now, if the problem is doesn't want to use calculators, I'd like to try to figure out some way to get around that. I also find kids that cannot do algebra go to geometry and calculus just fine. You know, there seem to be spotty skills. I've seen situations where the child was passing high-level physics and couldn't graduate from high school. I think one of the ways to get around this is to sign up for a few classes in the college in things you're good at and do so good that you get a professor interested in you, and there can be ways to get around some of these requirements. You know, but he's going to need to go in there and do gorgeous architecture projects or something like that. And then sometimes you can get in the back door. And then I'd want to ask more questions about why the calculator is such a problem. Maybe we get a different kind of calculator.
Okay, interesting. Lots of questions about music. Do you like music? Is music a comfort to you? And do you think music is a beneficial thing to teach individuals on the autism spectrum?
Absolutely, yes. There are some kids that can learn to sing their words before they learn to speak them, because singing is on different circuits. So, yes, I think music definitely should be introduced to kids. There's some kids where high-pitched sounds are going to hurt the ears, so maybe flute might be a bad idea.
Okay.
There's others that don't like drums. Yes, I definitely, if they really like music, then go with it.
Okay, and do you like music? Do you personally find it relaxing? Do you listen to music?
Yes, I like to listen to some classical. I like Johnny Cash country, and there's certain kinds of pounding rock that I just hate.
Okay.
It's sort of like a jackhammer on my head, but a lot of music I like.
Do you listen to music in the car when you're driving?
Yes, I do.
And Johnny Cash is your favorite?
Yeah, that's one of my favorite CDs. I also really like Beatles.
Oh, cool. Very, very cool. Another person who writes, I read where you said that before you became verbal, you would get so frustrated you would scream. I have a 7-year-old grandson who is high functioning on the spectrum. He has a speech delay, but is now fully verbal, and in a regular first grade class. His 2.5-year-old brother chatters a lot but says very few real words. However, he does a lot of screaming and grunting. I can tell it is out of frustration. Do you remember what happened when you finally began to speak? Was it the result of speech therapy, or did you just wake up one morning and start talking?
No, I had problems with expressive language, and I had a hard time getting my words out. And you'll see brain scans in the Autistic Brain book that show how I had difficulty getting my words out because the circuits were smaller than normal. And speech problems can be variable. You can have problems with expressive language, problems with hearing, where the hard consonant sounds are not heard, or the kid might be echolalic, but he doesn't know what it means. My speech came in slowly, a few stressed words at a time. But I want to emphasize, these things are very variable.
Okay, but I listen to you now, Temple, and you are so expressive, and you are such a brilliant speaker. Is it just that you continued to work, and that the people around you just didn't let up and kept working on those skills with you? What do you attribute your success to in the area of in this area of verbal communication?
Lots of hard work. You've got to keep learning. When I gave my first talk in graduate school, I panicked and I walked out. And you just get better the more you do it. You just keep learning. It's gradual. There's no single turning point, no single breakthrough.
Okay, absolutely. And I know we have to let you go in a minute. Have we got you for just like 2 more minutes?
Okay.
Okay. I want to know, you talked a little bit about art, and we had many questions, people writing about art, and for kids who already seem to have an ability with art, how much do we want to encourage that with autism? And for children who get frustrated doing art, is it something that we want to keep massaging and have them continue, don't give up on art, have it be a part of their curriculum?
Well, if the child's good at art, I want to develop it, because art's the basics of my design career. Child's good at art, develop it. I wasn't allowed to just do constant horse heads. We're going to have to learn how to draw other things. And if you have a child that absolutely hates art, well, there's a point where I'm going to back off.
Okay.
Don't pound on the thing that they have difficulty with. Build on the area of strength. Build on the thing the child's good at, with the goal of turning it into a career.
Okay. A question about learning other languages. People wanted to know if you think that's
terrible.
They want to know if you studied Latin.
I never studied Latin, but I got a D in French.
Okay.
But then on the other hand, you've got autistic kids that absolutely excel in language.
Okay.
This is where you get back to the uneven skills.
Right.
Some are going to be super good at this, and others are going to be super bad like me.
Okay, we are out of time, but we appreciate you so much, Temple. You are an inspiration to all of us, and I know you got a lot of things to do to promote your book. Again, it's called The Autistic Brain, and it comes out on the 30th of April.
Yes, and you can pre-order on Amazon now.
Okay, great. So we want everybody to do that. We just absolutely adore you. We hope that once you're done promoting the book that we can have, because I have pages more of questions and pages more of praise that we might have to email to you, because so many people wanted to tell you how much they adore you, how much you've helped them with their children, and individuals who are on the spectrum, how much you've inspired them. So we thank you so much, Temple.
Well, thank you, and I hope I've given some parents and teachers some insights today.
You absolutely have.
I can't emphasize enough the importance of good teachers and people that just work with me.
Well, we appreciate that, and I think you've given great advice for all of them. And I hope you can dig out from the snow.
Okay, thank you so much.
Take care. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Yeah, bye.